Cold. That was the first thing he felt. Not the clinical cold of an air conditioner, but an ancient, stone-like cold that numbed his bones. Cassell Ardent opened his eyes and saw the ceiling. A high, vaulted ceiling with cracks where spiders lived. He was lying face down on the floor of the throne room. Someone had hit him on the back of the head, or he had fallen on his own. His head was splitting. It was swarming with memories that weren't his own. 23 years of a life he hadn't lived but remembered down to the very last second. His father's name. The smell of burnt porridge in the kitchen when he was 16. Shame. The eternal, unending shame of a destitute nobleman. But there was something else, too. Knowledge that didn't belong to this world. Formulas. Tables. The structure of debt obligations. A model of reputational capital he'd been developing for 10 years. 2 memories lived in one mind, and neither was about to give way. Someone tossed a coin at his back. It clinked against a stone and rolled toward his hand. Cassell picked it up. Lead. Counterfeit. The hall erupted in laughter. 3 dozen nobles in silk doublets stood in a semicircle, watching as the 23-year-old baron rose from his knees. His cloak was patched in 6 places. His cheekbones jutted out from hunger. His name in this court sounded like a curse. Castle the beggar. The boy who, at 16, had hauled leftovers out through the back door of the palace kitchen. The boy whose father, Baron Tobias Ardent, had gambled away a 300-year-old inheritance at the card table at the Mercers. Everyone knew this story. Everyone loved it. It was the perfect anecdote for receptions. Chancellor Anselm Hallstrom stood on a dais to the right of the empty throne, a thin man with colorless eyes and slender fingers that had never known calluses. He unrolled the scroll and began to read. His voice was as steady as a ruler. For the debts of the late Baron Tobias Ardent, amounting to 200,000 crowns. For the Ardent family's inability to service its interest obligations. For the lack of male heirs in the 12 noble houses in debt. Pursuant to the Edict on Marital Redemption, 12 brides from ruined families are petitioning Baron Cassell Ardent.
He is obligated to take them as wives within 24 hours. He inherits their debts. He receives their lands and titles. If in 90 days the royal audit shows that the barony is insolvent, all 13 will be sent to the debtor's pit. Disagreement with the edict is punishable by immediate imprisonment. The hall buzzed. Someone clapped. Someone whistled. 12 brides. It wasn't even a punishment. It was a joke. The most expensive joke in the history of the court. Usually, a poor nobleman would be saddled with a single bride debtor carrying a debt of 10 to 15,000. That alone was already considered a death sentence. Not a single one had ever survived. And here there were 12. The total debt, combined with his own, amounted to 200,000 crowns. 200,000 crowns with 0 assets, with a half-ruined castle and no peasants. At an interest rate of 20% per month, that meant that in 30 days, the debt would rise to 240,000. In 60 days, to 288,000. In 90 days, by the time of the audit, he would owe nearly 350,000 crowns. And he wouldn't have a single one. Cassell was on his knees, staring at the lead coin in his hand. That his memories finally stopped clashing with one another and coalesced into a single clear thought. He knew this scheme, not from this world, from another. There, it was called subordinated debt with a floating rate, a toxic asset, a junk bond. He'd been doing exactly this for 10 years. He took on companies that everyone considered dead, companies with negative equity, companies that owed more than they were worth, and he pulled them out, every single one after another, because he understood something that no one else in this room understood. Debt isn't a death sentence. Debt is a tool. 200,000 crowns isn't a pit. It's seed capital. You just need to know how to turn it around. And then a voice rang out in his head. Quiet, businesslike, emotionless, audit initiated, assets, 0, liabilities, 200,000 crowns. Interest rate, 20% per month. Collateral, 12 brides. Recommendation, convert debt obligations into trust capital. Trust capital points, 0. Baron Ardent's honor, 14 out of 100. Solvency rating, critical.
First task, restructure the principal debt. Deadline, 30 days. Castle blinked. The numbers hung before his eyes. He saw them just as clearly as he saw the Chancellor's face. It was impossible. It was madness. And it was exactly what he needed. He rose from his knees. He brushed off his cloak. He put the lead coin in his pocket. Then he turned to the 12 girls standing in a semicircle against the far wall. One was crying. A thin, dark-haired girl of about 15 was clutching a stack of papers to her chest and sobbing silently. Standing next to her was a woman with glasses, older than the rest. She wasn't crying. She looked at Castle with cold calculation, just as a shopper at the market looks at a rotten apple. To their left, a tall red-headed girl with a burned right hand was boring him with a gaze that made him want to take a step back. She wasn't afraid. She hated him. To the right stood a girl in white. Her back was perfectly straight back, perfectly folded hands, a perfectly blank face. She was silent. Castle knew from others' recollections that she hadn't spoken in 3 years. Behind them all, standing slightly to the side, was another, tall, fair-haired, with a posture instilled from birth. Adelina Verhagen, the daughter of a ruined marquis. She wasn't looking at Cassel, but right through him, as if he didn't exist, as if everything happening was beneath her notice. Above her head, numbers flickered that only he could see. Honor, 41. Debt, 28,000 crowns. Favor, -5. Minus. The only one out of 12 with a negative value. Cassel whistled to himself. She'll be the hardest one to deal with. He shifted his gaze to the redhead, Isla Ronswood. Numbers were glowing above her, too. Honor, 63. Debt, 22,000 kroner. Favorability, 3. 3 isn't much, but at least it's not negative. Next, the woman in glasses, Marilyn Voss, a widow, 25 years old. Honor, 78. Favorability, 12, the highest starting score. She was the only one who looked at him without fear or hatred. She was simply assessing him. The girl in white, So-Yeon Park. Honor, 89. Favorability, 8. She didn't move. She didn't blink. She stood like a porcelain figurine. Cassel thought that if this girl were to speak, the entire hall would fall silent. Chancellor Hallström rolled up the scroll and looked down at Castle. He asked whether Baron Ardent agreed to accept the terms of the edict. The hall fell silent. Everyone expected Castle to beg, or to cry, or to try to run away. 2 guards by the door had already placed their hands on the hilts of their swords. Castle looked at the Chancellor, then at the 12 girls, then back at the Chancellor, and said one word. "I agree." The silence lasted 3 seconds. Then the hall erupted in laughter. The Chancellor allowed himself a subtle smile. He leaned toward Lord Mercer, standing next to him, and whispered something. Castle didn't hear the words, but he saw the numbers above the Chancellor's head. Honor, 9. 9 out of 100. The man who ruled the kingdom had a trust rating of 9. That spoke volumes about him, more than any whisper ever could. The wedding took place that same evening. No feast, no music. The priest recited the vows 12 times in a row, changing only the bride's name each time. Castle stood at the altar and watched as 12 girls approached him one by one. Each placed her hand in his. Hannah Shin's hand smelled of mint. Lyra Cassandra's hand trembled. Ayla Ronswood's hand was hot and rough with calluses. Adelina Verhagen's hand was ice cold, and she pulled it away the very second the priest uttered the final word. The system beeped after each ceremony. Plus 100 capital points. New pledge accepted. Marriage contract registered. After the 12th ceremony, a new line appeared in his mind. Total assets. Lands of the 12 clans. Estimated value. 180,000 kroner. Encumbrance, 100%. All the lands are mortgaged, every last scrap of them. But Castle was looking at a different number. Total household honor. 492 out of 1,200. Average 41. It wasn't brilliant, but it was more than zero. Much more. 492 units of honor. 12 women whom the whole world had written off as worthless. 12 sets of skills. Blacksmith, calligrapher, accountant, singer, apothecary, diplomat, cook, groom, architect, navigator, glassblower, mathematician. He stood at the altar and counted. Not money. People. The night after the wedding, Ardent Castle. A half-ruined fortress 3 days' journey from the capital.
The 12 brides scattered to their rooms and locked the doors. Each expected the worst. Castle heard the bolts click shut one after another. He didn't go to any of them. Instead, he went down to the library. Library was a stretch. It was a room with 3 shelves holding dusty volumes on the history of the Ardent family. He lit a candle. He sat down at the table and began to work. The system laid out the full picture before him. 12 financial profiles, 12 stories of bankruptcy, 12 sets of obligations with interest rates and due dates. He read them just as he had once read the reports of companies on the brink of collapse. Profile 1. Ayla Ronswood. Debt, 22,000 kroner. Creditor, the House of Mercer. Interest rate, 20% per month. Collateral, a blacksmith's yard in the lower quarter of the capital. Collateral status, seized 3 years ago. Note, the blacksmith's yard is not in use. It stands empty. The Mercers bought it solely to eliminate a competitor to their arms factory. Castle made a note. An idle asset on the creditor's books. This can be used. Profile 2. Soyeon Park. Debt, 18,000 krone. Creditor, the Crown. Interest rate, 15% per month. Reason for the debt? A fine for forging the royal seal. Soyeon didn't forge it. Her father was framed. Castle could see it in the numbers. Soyeon's honor rating was 89. A person who forges seals never has an honor rating higher than 20. Someone lied. Someone used her family. He made a second note. Profile number 3. Marilyn Voss. Debt, 31,000 kroner. Creditor, the Valio Guild. Interest rate, 22% per month, the highest of them all. Valio was deliberately strangling her. Why? Because she had worked as their accountant for 5 years and knew their secrets. The debt was a muzzle. As long as she owed Valio, she would remain silent. If she spoke up, they would raise the interest rate and take her son away. Castle worked until dawn. 12 profiles, 12 plans. For each one, he devised an individual repayment strategy. Not a generic one, a personalized one. Because Ayla's debt had to be tackled by redeeming a non-performing collateral. Soyeon's debt by contesting a false accusation. Marilyn's debt through a counterclaim regarding illegal interest rates. Every debt had its weak spot. All he had to do was find it. When the first ray of sunlight fell on the table, Castle stacked the 12 sheets into a pile. He stood up. He stretched his stiff neck. And he went upstairs. He knocked on each door in turn. They didn't open right away. Some didn't open at all. He slipped a sheet under the door and moved on. Hannah was the first to open the door. She looked at the map in silence. Then she looked up at Castle. He saw the favor number above her head flicker. +3, 9. Soyeon didn't open the door. She opened the window. She leaned out and took the sheet from his hands without saying a word. +2, 10. Castle froze. 10. That was the threshold. At 10 favor points, the first secret is revealed. Soyeon looked at him from the window. Her lips moved. He could barely make it out. She said one word. Thank you. It was the first word she had spoken in 3 years. The system chimed. Soyeon Park's hidden card has been partially revealed. Skill, handwriting forgery. Mastery level. Castle nodded to her and moved on. Castle stood in the castle courtyard and looked at the bailiff. 5,000 crowns in 30 days. He didn't have 5,000.
He didn't even have 5 crowns. All he had was a dilapidated castle and 12 women behind him. Some of them were standing on the balcony watching. Marilyn, wearing glasses. Hannah, holding a sprig of mint. Clarissa, holding scraps of Adelina's torn-up plan, which she had picked up for some reason and was trying to piece back together. Castle asked the bailiff to deliver a message to his creditor, Lord Augustine Mercer. The bailiff raised an eyebrow. Castle said he wanted to offer Lord Mercer a new promissory note for 250,000 crowns. The bailiff thought he must have misheard. 250. That was 50,000 more than the current debt. Why would a debtor voluntarily increase his debt? It made no sense. Castle explained, slowly, just as he had once explained to his partners in the conference room on the 42nd floor. Baron Arden's current debt was 200,000 crowns at 20% per month. That's 240% per annum. In a year, the debt would grow to 680,000. In 2 years, to 1,800,000. In 3 years, to 5 million. Lord Mercer would never receive that money. Because Baron Arden would be in a debt trap in 90 days. A dead debtor doesn't pay interest. Castle proposed another option, a new promissory note, 250,000 crowns, an interest rate of 3% per annum, a term of 15 years, secured by 12 estates, 50,000 crowns as a bonus for agreeing. Those 50,000 on top of that are a gift to Mercer. Payment for agreeing to long-term money instead of short-term. If Mercer refuses, Castle will declare bankruptcy tomorrow morning. Mercer will get nothing. If he agrees, he'll get 250,000 plus interest, guaranteed. The bailiff was silent. Observer Valio, on horseback, was also silent. Marilyn, on the balcony, took off her glasses and wiped them. It was the only time Castle had ever seen her nervous. The bailiff asked from what funds the Baron intended to pay even 3%. Castle replied that that was his concern. He asked that the offer be conveyed to Lord Mercer in exactly the words he had spoken. The bailiff left. Castle stood in the courtyard and did the math. 3% of 250,000 was 7,500 crowns a year. 625 a month. That was still a lot for a man with no income, but it was 32 times less than 40,000 a month at the old rate. 32 times. The difference between life and death. 6 hours of silence. Castle spent them in the library. He sat at the table and sketched a diagram, a rectangle in the center. Ardent Bank, lines radiating from it to 12 circles. Each circle represented a bride. Each bride represented a skill. Each skill represented potential income. Ayla, blacksmithing. Hannah, pharmacy. Marilyn, bookkeeping. Soyon, notary services. Lyra, entertainment. Clarissa, accounting. Adelina, diplomacy. Bridget, cooking. Yona runs the stables. Mei Lin handles construction. Rowena manages logistics. Tai He works with glass and ceramics. 12 lines of business in a single household. None of these businesses existed yet, but each one could, with the right startup capital, which they didn't have. A pigeon flew in at sunset. A small bundle was tied to its leg. Marilyn was the first to catch it. She unwrapped the paper and read it. Then she looked up at Castle. She said that Mercer had agreed. Castle didn't move. He had been expecting this. He knew Mercer would agree. Because Mercer was greedy, but not stupid. 0 is worse than 250,000 in the long run. It's simple math. The system clicked in his head. Plus 500 capital points. The first financial instrument unlocked. Restructuring. Castle exhaled. The first step was taken. 89 days remained. Marilyn stood beside him and looked at him. She asked how he knew such things. Castle replied that he had read a lot. She said that in her 25 years of life, including 5 years working for Valio, she had never once seen anyone restructure debt in the debtor's favor. She said it's usually the other way around. The creditor imposes restructuring to increase the debt, not to reduce it. Castle shrugged and said that the opposite works too, if you present it the right way. Marilyn was silent for a long time. Then she said that the error in the third line of her plan hadn't been corrected yet. Castle nodded and promised to fix it. That evening, he gathered everyone in the large hall. Not everyone showed up. Adelina didn't come. Ayla came, but stood by the door with her arms crossed over her chest. The rest sat down on the benches. Castle stood before them and said that he had restructured their total debt. That instead of 40,000 crowns a month, they now owed 625. That this didn't solve the problem, but it gives them time, 90 days. In 90 days, there will be an audit. If they don't show an income of 15,000 and assets of 60,000, it's all over. A debt trap. For all 13 of them.
He said he wasn't going to lie. The odds are bad, but there's still a chance. He said that each of them has a skill, and that he was going to turn those skills into money. Lyra raised her hand. She asked how he was going to turn her singing into money, if she couldn't sing for free. Every song sung without Valio's permission takes a year off her life. Castle looked at her. Numbers glowed above her head. Debt, 19,000 krone. Burden, a magical contract on her voice. Favor, 15. He said he'd figure it out. Lyra didn't look convinced, but she nodded. Hannah raised her hand next. She said her sister needed medicine. That without it, the girl wouldn't survive even a month. That the medicine cost 3,000 kroner and was available only from the Mercers.
Her voice didn't tremble, but her hands did. Cassell looked at her and said he knew that it was part of her plan. Hannah said the plan called for finding an alternative source of funding. She asked what that meant exactly. Cassell replied that he didn't know yet, but he would find out. That night, Cassell sat alone in the library. The candle was burning down. He thought about Hannah and her sister. 3,000 crowns. He didn't have 3,000. The system prompted him. The insurance tool is available upon reaching 1,000 capital points. Current balance, 500 points. 500 more needed. Where to get 500 points? Points are generated when a debt is voluntarily repaid. Any debt. By anyone. He needed someone to pay off their debt honestly and voluntarily. Then the system would count it. But who does anyone in the area owe money to? And who would pay it back voluntarily? Morning of the third day. Cassell left the castle and headed for the village of Ardent. 30 households, 120 people. All were technically serfs of the Ardent family, but in reality had been left to fend for themselves 15 years ago when Baron Tobias stopped doing anything but playing cards. The houses were crooked, the fields were half overgrown, the only mill stood without a wing. Castle walked down the main street and saw numbers above the head of everyone he passed. Peasant Olt, honor, 55. Debt, 0. Blacksmith Barg, honor, 41. Debt, 200 crowns. Creditor, the neighboring merchant. Miller Graham, honor, 60. Debt, 0. Old Woman Pill, honor, 78. Debt, 0. People with high honor and almost no debts. They were poor, but in no debt. That was a good foundation. Castle found the blacksmith Barg, a large, stooped man with red hands and tired eyes. He looked at the new baron with suspicion. Everyone in the village knew about the 12 weddings. Everyone thought the new baron was crazy. Castle asked Barg how he could help. Barg said that the castle gate had been hanging by a single hinge for 3 years. He could fix it, but he had no iron. He'd borrowed 200 crowns from the merchant Hell for iron 6 months ago, but the iron turned out to be rusty, and he hadn't been able to repair the gate. Now he owed Hell 200 crowns and couldn't pay him back. Castle took out a sheet of paper. The first Ardent promissory note. He wrote, Baron Castle Ardent hereby undertakes to pay the blacksmith Barg 300 crowns for repairing the castle gate, due in 14 days, secured by the honor of the Ardent family. He affixed his seal to the paper, or rather, what remained of it, a dull tin ring bearing the Ardent coat of arms. The impression was barely visible, but the system responded. The promissory note was activated. The note's strength is determined by the recipient's honor. Barg's honor was 41. The bill's power was low. Barg looked at the paper, then at Castle. He said that the last time Baron Ardent had given anyone a promissory note, it was his father, and he hadn't paid. Castle said he wasn't his father. Barg took the bill. Castle went to see the merchant, Hell. Hell was a fat man with shrewd eyes and an honor of 29. Castle offered him a deal. He would write Hell a promissory note for 200 crowns in exchange for forgiving Barg's debt. Hell would receive 200 crowns from the Baron in 14 days. Barg would be free of debt and able to work. Hell thought it over. He looked at the paper. He looked at the faded seal. And he agreed. Because 200 crowns in 14 days is better than 200 crowns never. Castle didn't know where he'd get 200 crowns in 14 days, but he knew that solutions come to those who take action. Barg learned that his debt had been forgiven that same evening. He was standing in his smithy and silently looked at Castle. Then he said he'd start repairing the gate tomorrow. Castle said he'd be glad to. The system beeped. The debt was repaid voluntarily through mediation, plus 100 capital points, plus 3 to the honor of the village of Ardent. Total score, 600 points. 400 more to go until 1,000. Morning of the 5th day. Castle stood in the middle of the village of Ardent and watched the people. 30 households, 120 souls. The villagers came out of their houses and eyed him warily.
The new baron who had married 12 debtors. The new baron who walks through the village without guards and talks to blacksmiths. They didn't know what to make of him. He didn't know what to make of them. But he needed 400 capital points in 10 days, and the only way to get them was for the people around him to pay back their debts. He began going from farm to farm. Every farm had its own story. The farmer Olt. Honor, 55. Debt, 0. But people owed him. His neighbor Tren owed him 3 sacks of grain from last fall. Tren. Honor, 38. Debt, 3 sacks of grain. Creditor, Olt. Castle went to Tren's, a thin, nervous man with shifty eyes. Castle asked why he wasn't giving the grain to Olt. Tren said he had no grain, that last year's harvest had been poor, that he could barely feed his own family. Castle looked at the numbers. Tren was telling the truth. His debt stood at 38, not because of dishonesty, but out of helplessness. He wanted to pay, but couldn't. Castle proposed a plan. Olt needed grain. Tren had nothing to give, but Tren has his hands and 10 sotkas of unplowed land. Castle drew up a promissory note. Tren agrees to plow 2 fields for the miller, Graham. In exchange, Graham will grind grain for Olt for free. Castle will pay Olt 3 sacks of grain from the village's future harvest. 3 parties, 3 obligations. Not a single krona in cash. Only labor and promises. Tren agreed because he was offered a way to pay off his debt. Not with money, but with labor. Olt agreed because he received grain. Graham agreed because he received a plowed field. The system clicked. A 3-party barter contract was executed through promissory note intermediation, plus 150 capital points. A new mechanism, the ring chamber. Castle blinked. 150 points for a single transaction. That was more than he'd expected. The system rewarded complexity. The more parties involved, the more points. 750 points, up to 1,250. Castle didn't return to the castle. He walked further through the village. A second debt. Sarna's widow owed the carpenter Red for roof repairs. 60 crowns. Red owed the tanner Mull for boots. 30 crowns. Mull owes Mrs. Sarna for 3 months of laundry. 20 crowns. A vicious cycle. 3 people who owe each other, and none of them can pay because they're waiting for payment from someone else. Castle sat down on a log and drew a diagram. A triangle. 3 arrows. Each arrow represents a debt. The totals don't add up, but the direction is clear. He proposed a mutual offset. Sarna forgives Mull 20 crowns. Mull forgives Red 30. Red reduces Sarna's debt by 50. Sarna pays the remaining 10 crowns to Red in flour. 3 signatures, 3 sighs of relief. The system, plus 120 points. Circular mutual settlement. Village honor, plus 2, 870 points. Castle continued. By the evening of the 5th day, he had resolved 4 debt disputes. Total score, 930 points, up to 1,070. On the day, he found 2 more. Old man Kemmer owed his son Mark an apology.
Not money, an apology. He had accused his son of stealing a goat 3 years ago. It wasn't Mark who stole the goat, but a traveling merchant. Kemmer knew this but couldn't admit it out loud. Pride. Castle went to see Kemmer. The old man was sitting on the porch smoking his pipe. His honor rating was 29, low. For a farmer with 40 years of work experience, that was suspiciously low. Castle sat down next to him and said he knew about the goat. Kemmer tensed up. Castle said he didn't know the details, but could see that something was weighing on Kemmer, that his honor was too low for a man who'd worked his whole life. Of course, he didn't actually say the word honor. He said you could tell when someone was troubled. Kemmer was silent for a long time. Then he said he'd been lying to his son for 3 years. Castle didn't reply. He just sat there beside him. An hour later, Kemmer got up and walked over to Mark's house. Castle didn't follow him, but the system beeped 20 minutes later. The debt of honor has been repaid, plus 80 points. Kemmer's honor, plus 22. Total, 1,010 capital points. 1,000. The system opened a new panel. The insurance tool has been unlocked. Description: creation of an insurance pool from voluntary contributions by participants to cover unforeseen expenses. Requirement: a minimum of 10 participants. Minimum contribution: 10 crowns per person. Castle closed his eyes and exhaled. Now he had to act quickly. Hannah's sister had 4 days left. Day 7. Castle gathered the villagers in the square by the mill. Not everyone had come. 23 out of 120. The rest watched from their windows. He stood on an upside-down barrel and began to speak. He said he was proposing a deal, not an order, a deal. Anyone who paid 10 crowns into the common fund would be entitled to free medical treatment once a year. Any kind of treatment: medicines, herbs, a trip to see a doctor in town. The common fund would pay for everything. 10 crowns a year, less than the cost of a single doctor's visit. The peasants exchanged glances. Old woman Pill asked, "What if no one gets sick?" Castle said that in that case, the money would remain in the fund until the following year, and the fund would grow. The blacksmith Barg asked who would manage the money. Castle said it would be Hannah Shin, the herbalist's daughter. She would serve as both the fund's manager and its chief healer. Hannah was standing nearby. She hadn't known Castle was going to announce this. She looked at him. He nodded at her. The first 3 signed up right away. Barg, because he trusted Castle after the incident with the gate. Old woman Pill, because she was 72 and any illness could be her last. Miller Graham, because his back ached from work. By the evening of the 7th day, 19 people had signed up, 190 crowns. On the 8th day, 11 more, 300 crowns. On the 9th day, people came from the neighboring village, 12 people. Word spread quickly. By the end of the 9th day, there were 42 participants in the insurance pool. 420 crowns. Not enough. 3,000 crowns for the medicine. 420 in the pool. Castle added his 200, the last 200 crowns that Marilyn had found in a hiding place under the library floorboard. Apparently, Baron Tobias had stashed them away for a rainy day and forgotten about them. 620 crowns, still a long way from 3,000. Castle sat down at the table again and thought. The system offered a suggestion. The insurance tool allows you to issue an insurance promissory note. A promissory note secured by future contributions from pool participants. The pool's projected income for the next year based on the current growth in participants. 2,000 crowns. Castle could issue a promissory note for 2,000 crowns, secured by future contributions to the insurance fund. It was a risk. If the members stopped paying, the promissory note would become a worthless piece of paper. But the members' honor rating averaged 54. That meant most would pay. Not all, but most. He wrote the promissory note. 2,000 crowns, secured by the Ardent Insurance Pool. Maturity, 1 year. Then he wrote a letter to Lord Mercer. He asked to buy a cure for bubonic fever in exchange for the insurance pool's promissory note and 620 crowns in cash. The total amount was 2,620, not 3,000. Less.
Castle added a note. He wrote that the medicine had been sitting in the mercer's warehouse for 8 months already, that its shelf life was 12 months. In 4 months, it would become useless. Mercer would lose $3,000. Or he could sell it now for $2,620 and get at least something. A familiar pattern. The same logic as with the restructuring. Something is better than nothing. The messenger brought the reply on the 10th day. In the morning, Hannah was standing in the courtyard, waiting. She'd been standing there since dawn. She didn't move. She was looking at the road. Castle stood beside her. He wasn't moving either. Lyra was sitting on the steps. Marilyn was looking out the window. Even Isla had come out onto the balcony. The messenger appeared on the hill. He was carrying a bag. Hannah didn't run. She waited until he pulled up. She took the bag. She opened it. Inside was a vial. Dark glass. The mercer's wax seal. Medicine. Hannah pressed the vial to her chest. She closed her eyes. Her fingers turned white from how tightly she was clutching the glass. She wasn't crying. She just stood there, breathing. The system beeped. The insurance tool has been successfully applied. Plus 200 capital points. Hannah's favor plus 15. 21. Hannah opened her eyes. She looked at Castle. Then she did something she hadn't done even once in all these days. She hugged him. Quickly, briefly, with one arm. With the other, she held the vial close. Then she stepped back and ran toward the stable. She had to ride for half a day to reach her sister. Castle watched as she saddled the horse. Yona helped her. Silently, she tightened the girth. Hannah rode off. On the steps, Lyra began to sing softly. Not a song, just a melody without words. She was allowed a melody without words. Valio's contract forbade singing songs. A melody didn't count. A small loophole. The melody was sad and beautiful. Castle listened and thought that this was the first moment in 10 days when the castle felt like a place where people lived, rather than a prison for 13 condemned men. Then the melody broke off. Lyra fell silent. Castle turned around. A man was standing in the castle's doorway. Young, richly dressed, with a thin mustache and a smug smile. Numbers glowed above his head. Honor, 12. Duty, unknown. Favor, not applicable. He was neither a peasant nor a bailiff. He was a nobleman. Castle strained his borrowed memory. The name surfaced a second later. Felix Durant. Isla Ronswood's cousin. The heir to a minor noble house who had hoped to inherit the Ronswood lands, that is, until Castle married Isla and claimed those lands for himself. Felix stood in the doorway, smiling. He had brought an entourage, 3 people, a servant, a secretary, and a man with a sword. Not a soldier, a mercenary. Felix said he had come to visit his cousin. Castle told him that Isla was in the castle. Felix said he'd like to speak with her in private. Castle said that Isla would decide for herself whether she wanted to speak with him. Felix smiled even wider. He said he wasn't asking permission from a beggar. He said that the Ronswood lands belonged to the Ronswood family, not to some penniless baron with 12 debt-ridden wives. He said this loudly, so that everyone could hear. Isla came out. She stood behind Castle. Castle didn't turn around, but he felt the heat, literally. She radiated warmth like a blacksmith's forge. Felix saw her and changed his tone, softer. He said he was worried about her, that the family was worried, that there was a way to annul this shameful marriage and restore her freedom. Isla was silent. Castle was silent too. He waited. Felix continued. He said that if Isla signed a waiver of her rights to the Ronswood lands in his favor, He would take her away from this castle and give her a life in the capital. A decent life, not this one. Castle turned to Felix. He asked if he could clarify one point. Felix nodded. Castle asked if he understood correctly that Felix Durant was proposing that his wife sign a document transferring property to a third party in the presence of an armed mercenary, without a notary, without witnesses from the small council, without her husband's consent. He listed the 4 articles of the Code on Noble Property that this violated. Castle's retentiveness was surprisingly useful when it came to the law. Baron Tobias was a swindler, but an educated one. Felix flushed. He said he had no intention of taking a lecture from a scoundrel. Castle nodded and said, "Of course, but perhaps Felix would like to discuss his own debt first." Felix froze. "What debt?" Castle smiled. He looked at the numbers above Felix's head. A debt of 40 crowns. The creditor was Berta, an innkeeper from the lower quarter of the capital. 13 months overdue. The 12th day, Hannah returned. She arrived at dawn while the castle was still asleep. Castle hadn't been sleeping. He was sitting in the library, working on his drawings. He heard the clatter of hooves and went out into the courtyard. Hannah dismounted from her horse. Her face was ashen with fatigue and road dust, but her eyes were alive. She said her sister would live. The medicine had worked. The fever had subsided for the 2nd night in a row. The girl ate some broth and asked for the cat. Cassel nodded. Hannah stood in front of him and said nothing. Then she said she wanted to work. Cassel asked what she meant. Hannah said he had appointed her manager of the insurance pool. She wanted to get started. She wanted to visit every member of the pool, to map out the village's illnesses, to determine what could be treated with herbs and what required pharmacy medicines. Cassel said that was exactly what he needed. By noon, Hannah was already making her rounds through the courtyards with a canvas bag and a notebook. She examined children, the elderly, and women. She made diagnoses on the spot. Old woman Pill had arthritis. The miller's wife had kidney stones. 3 children had worms. Blacksmith Barga was developing a cough from coal dust that would become chronic in a year. Kana wrote everything down. The system indicated her favorability, 21, and honor, 74, high and stable. This woman knew what she was doing. Meanwhile, Cassel returned to his main task. The audit was in 78 days. He needed an annual income of 15,000 crowns and assets of 60,000. So far, he had neither. Income, where would it come from? The insurance pool brought in 420 crowns a year, a pittance. He needed to scale up, but scaling up required people, and people required trust, and trust is built slowly. There was one way he could speed up the process: do something visible. Something that would prove to everyone around him that Ardent Bank wasn't just a poor baron's fantasy, but a functioning mechanism. He decided to open the bank's first branch, in the castle, in the great hall where, 12 days earlier, plates of porridge had stood. Marilyn helped. She drafted the articles of incorporation on 4 pages. Castle dictated. She wrote. Soyan copied the charter 5 times. Her handwriting was impeccable. Every letter stood as straight as a soldier on parade. Castle hung a notice on the village gate. Ardent Bank, microcredits for farmers and artisans. Interest rate, 4% per annum. No collateral required. Collateral, the borrower's honor. First business day in 3 days. Castle spent 3 days preparing. He found a table, 2 chairs, a quill and ink, a seal, candles. Marilyn became the chief financial officer. She knew bookkeeping better than anyone within a 100-mile radius. She knew because she had kept Valio's books for 5 years. She knew how to record income, how to write off expenses, how to calculate interest, how to balance the books. Castle trusted her with the numbers. He reserved strategy for himself. Day 15, the opening of Ardent Bank. Castle sat at a table in the great hall. Marilyn sat next to a thick ledger. Soyan stood by the door with a quill at the ready. Behind the door stood the peasants, 15 of them. They hadn't come because they believed. They'd come out of curiosity. The first to enter was Barg, the blacksmith. He said he needed 100 crowns for iron. Castle looked at his honor rating, 41, not very high, but Barg had already repaid 1 debt through Castle's mediation. That meant he was capable. Castle wrote out a promissory note, 100 crowns, 4% per annum, term, 6 months. Barg drew a cross in place of a signature. Soyan recorded the transaction. Marilyn entered it in the ledger. Second, Mrs. Sarna, the widow. 50 crowns to repair the roof before the fall rains. Credit rating, 52. Approved. Third, a young man named Thorn, 200 crowns for seeds for the spring planting. Credit rating, 36. A bit low. Castle thought for a moment. The system suggested that with an honor rating below 40, the promissory note would be weak. It would be easy to forge and easy to contest. Castle looked at Thorn. The young man was 20. His hands were shaking. He was nervous. Castle asked why he needed 200 crowns. Thorn said he wanted to sow a field of wheat. He explained that last year he'd tried, but hadn't had enough seed, so half the field had remained empty. The harvest had been small, and his girlfriend had left him for the miller's son because he could support her. Thorn wanted to try again. Castle wrote out the promissory note. Marilyn looked at him questioningly. Castle said quietly that sometimes you have to give people a chance. Marilyn said that a chance wasn't an accounting category. Castle replied that at his bank it was the top priority. By the evening of the 15th day, the bank had issued 12 microloans totaling 1,400 crowns. Castle was pulling the money out of thin air. He didn't have 1,400 crowns. He had 620 crowns in the insurance fund, plus a little more from the funds. But he wasn't lending money. He was issuing promissory notes, paper promises backed by honor. A promissory note from Barg for 100 crowns could be taken to the merchant Hell and exchanged for iron. Hell would accept the promissory note because he knew Barg, because the ardent seal was on the promissory note, because he had already received money once from Baron Ardent and the Baron hadn't cheated him. It was a chain of trust. Each subsequent promissory note depended on the previous one having been honored. One deception and the entire chain would collapse. Marilyn realized this on the bank's second day of operation. She approached Cassell that evening and told him that his system was both brilliant and suicidal at the same time. One default and the reputation is ruined. Cassell nodded. He knew that. He said that was exactly why he hadn't given a loan to Farmer Palt with a credit rating of 26. Marilyn asked, "What about Thorn with a credit rating of 36? Cassell said that Thorn wanted to plant a field for a girl. That a person who works for someone else pays back debts more often than one who works for himself. Marilyn took off her glasses. She wiped them, put them back on. She said that wasn't financial analysis, it was poetry. Castle shrugged and replied that in a world where money is backed by honor, poetry is financial analysis. The 20th day. The first repayment. Barg returned 100 crowns with interest. 104 crowns. He brought them in a leather pouch and placed them on the table in front of Marilyn. He said he had repaired the castle gate, 2 village gates, and the anvil for a neighbor's farm. 104 crowns. Marilyn made a note of it. The system beeped. The first microloan had been repaid in full, plus 50 points. Barg's honor plus 5. 46. 2 days later, Sarna paid her back. 52 crowns. She sold the old boards from the roof she'd repaired and made just enough. Plus 30 points. Sarna's honor up by 3. A week later, for more paid back. By the 30th day, 9 out of 12 borrowers had repaid. 3 hadn't paid back. Thorn hadn't paid back. It wasn't time yet. He still had half a year to go. 2 others were past due, but promised to pay back by next month. The repayment rate was 75 for the first month. For unsecured microloans, that was brilliant. But Castle wasn't celebrating. He was doing the math. The bank's income for the first month, 56 crowns in interest. At that rate, 670 crowns a year. He needed 15,000. He was 22 times behind. He needed to scale up, quickly. An idea came to him on the 25th day as he sat in the library looking at a map of the barony. The barony of Ardent bordered 3 other territories, the barony of Cram to the north, the county of Welt to the east, and the crown lands to the south. If he expanded the bank into the neighboring territories, the volume would grow 3 or 4 times. But that would require permission, or at least the absence of a prohibition. Castle pulled out the Code of Laws, a thick, dusty volume that Marilyn had found in the attic. He read all night. By morning, he had found what he was looking for. Article 147 of the Trade Code. Any baron has the right to conduct commercial activities within the boundaries of his barony without restrictions. Outside the barony, a license from the small council is required. The license costs 5,000 crowns. Castle didn't have 5,000 crowns. But Article 148 contained an exception. If commercial activities are conducted through an intermediary who is a resident of another barony, a license is not required. Castle needed an intermediary in a neighboring barony. He thought of Baron Cram. The system displayed his information. Baron Henrik Kram. Net worth, 57. Debt, 45,000 crowns. Creditor, the Valio Guild. Interest rate, 18% per month. Baron Kram was going under, slowly but surely. In a year, his barony would become the property of Valio. Castle could offer him the same arrangement. Restructuring, a new promissory note. Long-term money instead of short-term. In exchange for the right to open a branch of Ardent Bank on Kram's property. The 26th day, Castle rode out to Baron Kram on horseback. Alone. Marilyn said it was reckless. Isla said it was foolish. Clarissa calculated the probability of him being robbed along the way and came up with 32%. Castle set off. Kram Castle stood half a day's ride to the north.
Small but sturdy, Baron Kram turned out to be a heavy-set man of 50 with a red face and kind eyes. He received Cassel warily. He had heard about the 12 weddings. The whole region had heard. He asked if it were true that Cassel had restructured his debt with Mercer. Cassel confirmed it. Kram was silent for a moment. Then he said that Valley was being charged 18% a month, that in 8 months he would lose everything, that his wife was ill, that his son was serving in the capital and sent 20 crowns a month. That wasn't even enough to cover the interest. Cassel proposed a deal. He would restructure Kram's debt under the same terms. A new promissory note for 50,000 crowns, 3% per annum, 15 years. A 5,000 crown bonus for Valio's agreement. In exchange, Kram would grant permission to open a branch of Ardent Bank in the village of Kram. Kram looked at Cassel. His honor hovered above his head. 57. Enough to keep his word. Kram asked why Cassel was doing this. Why help a neighbor when he himself was in debt for 250,000? Cassel said that a single bank in a single village wouldn't survive. A network of banks across 10 villages would survive, because the risk is spread out, because if one borrower doesn't pay, the others cover it, because the more people in the system, the more stable the system. Kram didn't understand everything, but he understood the main point. Castle was offering him a way out of Valiant, for free, or rather, in exchange for a permit that cost him nothing. Kram agreed. They shook hands. The system chimed, plus 300 capital points. A partnership agreement. The bank's territory expanded. Castle drove back and thought, if Valio agreed to restructure Kram's debt the way Mercer had agreed to his. But Valio isn't Mercer. Mercer is greedy but predictable. Valio is Celeste, a woman who spent 20 years building an empire on other people's debts. She won't play by Castle's rules. She'll change the rules. Day 32. Marilyn left for the capital at dawn. Castle gave her one of the 2 Castle horses and 100 crowns for expenses. She took her son Tim with her, a 5-year-old boy with serious eyes and a habit of counting everything in sight. Steps, stones in the wall, apples on the tree. He told Castle that there were 312 steps in the castle. Castle checked. 314. Tim said the last 2 didn't count because they were broken. Castle didn't argue. Marilyn left and the castle grew quieter. She was the voice of reason, the one who said no when everyone else said yes, the one who found the mistake in the 3rd line. Without her, Castle felt like a captain who had removed his navigator from the ship. But Marilyn had her own mission, to get to Valio's old office in the lower quarter, to find the real books, to copy the necessary pages, to come back alive. Castle gave her 10 days. If she didn't return in 10 days, he would go after her himself. While Marilyn was in the capital, Castle set about the task he'd been putting off, Lyra's contract. A magical contract with Valio that forbade her from singing for free. Every unpaid song cost her a year of her life. Castle asked Lyra to show him the contract. She pulled a rolled-up parchment from under her pillow. She carried it with her everywhere, as a reminder, as a shackle. Castle unrolled the parchment and began to read. The text was written in archaic legal language. Cumbersome phrasing, long sentences. Castle read, while Castle's borrowed memory translated and Julian's memory analyzed. The contract had been drawn up 8 years ago when Lyra was 10. Her mother had signed it on her behalf. The terms? Lyra Cassander's voice serves as collateral for a debt owed by the House of Cassander in the amount of 19,000 krone. The borrower agrees to use the voice exclusively as directed by the lender. Any unauthorized use of the voice incurs a penalty of 1 year of the borrower's life. Castle reread the last line 3 times. A year of life. Not a metaphor. In this world, magical contracts were taken literally. A year of life meant a year of life. Lyra was 18. If she sang 1 song without permission, she would become 17. 2 songs, 16. 10 songs, 8. It was slavery disguised as a financial instrument. Castle felt something hot and dark rising inside him. Not Castle's anger, Julian's anger. Julian, who had worked with predatory loans for 10 years and had seen loan sharks destroy people's lives. But he had never seen a contract literally take away years of life. He pulled himself together and reread the contract. Now he wasn't looking for the content, but for loopholes. A sophomore would have found it in 10 minutes. It took Castle 3. Clause 4. The contract is signed by Lyra's mother as her legal guardian. Clause 6. The contract takes effect upon the borrower's coming of age. Clause 9. The age of majority in the Kingdom of Vermont is 18. Lyra turned 18 4 months ago. That means the contract has been in effect for 4 months. But, Clause 12, if the borrower marries before the first year of the contract has expired, all obligations are transferred to the spouse. Lyra married Castle 11 days ago. That means the obligations have been transferred to him. But, Clause 15, the penalty of 1 year's life applies to the borrower, not to the party holding the obligations, not to the spouse, to the borrower. The borrower is Lyra's mother, not Lyra. Lyra was the collateral, not a party to the contract. Castle reread it again. Yes, the contract was drawn up in her mother's name. Her mother was the borrower. Lyra was the collateral. The obligations were transferred to Castle as the collateral provider's spouse. But the penalty is tied to the borrower. Lyra's mother died 2 years ago. A dead borrower cannot lose a year of life. Therefore, the penalty clause is unenforceable. Therefore, the restriction on the use of her voice is not backed by a penalty. Therefore, Lyra can sing. The contract formally exists. The debt of 19,000 krone remains, but the penalty for singing has been waived. Castle called for Lyra. She came. He explained. Slowly, point by point. Lyra listened, and her eyes grew wider and wider. She asked if it was true. Castle said it was true, that the contract had been drawn up with an error, that the penalty clause is tied to the borrower, not the collateral, that her mother is dead and there's no one to impose the penalty on. Lyra was silent. Then she said she was afraid, that she hadn't sung a single song in 4 months because each one cost her a year, that she wasn't sure she wanted to take the risk. Castle said he understood. He said he wasn't asking her to sing. He said he just wanted her to know that she could. The system beeped. A legal trick. A loophole in the contract had been found. The penalty clause was neutralized. Lyra's favorability rating, +5. 22. Castle didn't show that he'd heard the chime. He just nodded to Lyra and walked out. Clarissa was standing outside the door. She'd heard the entire conversation. She looked at Castle and said she'd double-checked his logic, that he was right. Clause 15 unequivocally ties the penalty to the borrower. She added that if Valio tried to challenge this interpretation, they would lose in any court. Castle looked at the 15-year-old girl who had just conducted a legal analysis of a magical contract and found it to be correct. He thought that this girl would grow up to be something. Day 35. News from the village of Cram. Valio has refused the restructuring. Baron Cram sent a messenger with a letter. Valio did not accept the offer for a new promissory note. They said that Baron Cram could either pay at the old rate or surrender the land. There is no third option. Castle reread the letter. This was to be expected. Mercer agreed because he was alone. Valio won't agree because they are a system. The system doesn't make concessions to a single debtor. If Valio lowers the rate for Cram, all the other debtors will demand the same. Valio will lose millions.
They'd rather destroy Cram than set a precedent. Castle thought about it for 2 days. On the 37th day, he found a solution. Not an elegant one, a crude one, but it worked. If Valio wouldn't agree to restructuring, then Valio had to be taken out of the equation. How? By buying Cram's debt from Valio. Ardent Bank would buy Cram's promissory note from Valio. Valio gets the money. Cram gets a new creditor, Ardent Bank, with an interest rate of 3% instead of 18%. The problem? Cram's debt was 45,000 kroner. Castle didn't have 45,000. He didn't even have 1,000. But Cram's promissory note was worth 45,000 only on paper. On the market, it was worth much less. Because Cram couldn't pay. Because everyone knew he'd go bankrupt in 8 months. A junk asset. Castle knew how to deal with junk assets. He'd been doing it for 10 years. A discount. Buying distressed debt at a discount. A promissory note with a face value of 45,000 can be bought for 10 if the seller is certain he'll get nothing otherwise. Castle wrote a letter to Celeste Valio, not to Mercer, not to the intermediary, to Celeste herself. He offered to buy Baron Cram's promissory note for 15,000 kroner, a third of its face value. He wrote that he knew Cram wouldn't pay, that in 8 months the Valios would receive land worth 12,000 crowns and a heap of problems with the peasants who didn't want to change owners. Or they could sell the promissory note for 15,000 now and get cash in hand without the headache. He didn't know where he'd get 15,000 crowns, but he knew the instrument, a public bond. He had 2,400 capital points. The public bond instrument unlocked at 5,000. He didn't have enough. He needed to earn another 2,600 points in 2 months, or find another way. Day 38. It wasn't Castle who found another way. It was Soyan. She came to the library at night, quiet as always. She placed a sheet of paper in front of Castle. On the sheet was text written in her handwriting. Flawless handwriting. Every letter was like something out of a textbook. Castle read it. It was a copy of a letter from Chancellor Hallström to Lord Mercer, dated 3 years earlier. The content. The Chancellor asked Mercer to raise the interest rate for the Ronswood family from 15 to 20%. The reason? Ayla's father had refused to forge weapons for the Chancellor's personal guard. The Chancellor sought revenge. He used Mercer as a tool. The 5% increase turned a manageable debt into a fatal one. 6 months later, Ayla's father hanged himself. Castle looked up at Soyan. She stood motionless. Her face was expressionless, but her hands, the hands that had written this copy, were trembling. Castle asked where she had gotten it. Soyan said quietly, almost a whisper. She said she had seen the original of this letter in the Chancellor's office 3 years ago, when her father was still alive, when her family had not yet been accused of forging the seal. She had memorized every word, every curve of the letters, every smudge. She could reconstruct the text from memory down to the last comma. Castle looked at the numbers above her head. Favorability 20. Role unlocked. Personal notary and secretary to Baron Ardent. He asked why she was showing him this. Soyan was silent for a long time. Then she said that Castle was the first person in 3 years who hadn't asked her to forge anything. Everyone else who knew about her ability to copy handwriting wanted her to forge documents, wills, receipts. The Chancellor wanted her to forge the royal seal. When she refused, he framed her father. He accused him of the very thing she had refused to do. Her father was executed. She remained silent for 3 years, but Castle gave her a plan to pay off her debt and didn't ask her to write a single line. Only when she herself offered to become his secretary. Castle took the letter. It was a weapon, not a sword, a receipt. Proof that the Chancellor had used creditors as a tool for revenge, that he had deliberately ruined noble houses by manipulating interest rates. If this became public. But not now. It's too soon. He has no protection against the Chancellor. The Chancellor could crush the barony with a single decree. He needs to wait. He needs to grow. He needs to become too big to be crushed quietly. Castle hid the letter in a secret compartment under the floorboard, the very same one where Marilyn had found 200 crowns. Then he looked at Soyeon. She was standing there, waiting. He thanked her, not for the letter, for her trust. Soyeon nodded. She turned and left, silently, just as she had come. The system beeped. Soyeon Park's hidden card was fully revealed. Skill: copying any handwriting with perfect accuracy. Additional skill: photographic memory for documents. Favorability, +5. 25. The 40th day, Marilyn returned. She came back at night on an exhausted horse with Tim asleep in the saddle. Castle went out to meet her. Marilyn dismounted and nearly fell. She hadn't slept for 2 days. She was holding a leather folder under her arm. She handed it to Castle and said one word. Found it. Castle opened the folder. Inside were 23 sheets, copies of pages from the real Valio books. Marilyn had made them from memory, reconstructing the records she'd seen 5 years ago. Soyeon would help transcribe them with absolute precision later. But even these rough copies were a bombshell. 14 fictitious debts, 14 noble houses to which Valio had attributed debts that didn't exist. The total amount of the fictitious obligations, 120,000 crowns. Among the 14 houses were 3 of the 12 families of his brides. The Ronswood house's debt was inflated by 8,000. The Cassandra house's debt by 5,000. The Verhagen house's debt by 12,000. Castle looked at the figures. 12,000 in fictitious debt owed by Adelina, the woman who had derailed his plan on the very first day. The woman with a favorability rating of -5. Her family had been fleeced out of 12,000 crowns in debt that didn't exist. Her father, Marquis Verhagen, paid Valio more in interest on that 12,000 than the fictitious debt itself. He paid for nothing, his whole life, and he died thinking he owed it. Castle closed the folder. He looked at Marilyn. She was standing there, swaying with exhaustion. He asked if she had found anything about her late husband's debt. Marilyn nodded. Her voice was steady. She said that Baron Voss's debt of 31,000 kroner was actually 19,000. 12,000 had been added to it. Her husband had learned the total amount, 31,000. He decided that was the end. He didn't know that 12,000 of them didn't exist. He hanged himself because of a debt that didn't exist. Mahiril said this without any emotion, as if she were reading from an accounting report. Then she took off her glasses, wiped them, put them back on, and said she wanted to sleep. Cassell carried Tim into Marilyn's room. The boy didn't wake up. He was mumbling in his sleep. 314. Cassell tucked him in with a blanket and left. Hannah was standing in the hallway. She handed Marilyn a mug of mint tea. Marilyn took it without looking and went to her room. Hannah looked at Cassell. She asked if everything was all right. Cassell said it was fine. Hannah nodded. She knew it wasn't fine, but she didn't press the issue. She turned and left. Cassell was left alone in the castle's dark hallway, holding a folder that was worth more than his entire barony. 120,000 crowns in fictitious debts. Proof that the nobility had been robbing Valio for 20 years. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a bomb, and he didn't yet know when to set it off. Day 42. Cassell decided to talk to Adelina. He stood at her door and knocked. Silence. He knocked again. Silence. He said through the door that he had information about her family's debt, that 12,000 out of 28,000 had been falsely attributed to them, that her father had been paying interest on a non-existent debt. The silence lasted 10 seconds. Then the door opened. Adelina stood before him, straight as a ruler, cold as stone. She asked how he knew. Cassell said it was from Valio's accounting books. Adelina looked at him. Her eyes were dry and unmoving. She asked if he could prove it. Cassell said he could, in time. Adelina was silent. Then she said one word, "Thank you." She said it as if the word were a shard of glass stuck in her throat. Then she closed the door.
The system beeped. Adelina Verhagen's favorability, plus 15. 10. Positive for the first time. At 10, the first secret is revealed. Cassell waited. The system was silent for a second. Then it displayed the text. Adelina Verhagen's hidden card has been partially revealed. Adelina had been Chancellor Hallström's secret protege for 2 years. The Chancellor had been grooming her to be the Crown Prince's future wife. She knows the location of the Chancellor's secret office.
She knows the names of 3 of his agents at court. She doesn't understand the value of this information. Day 50. Cassell stood in front of the map on the library wall and counted. 40 days until the audit. The bank's income for a month and a half? 290 kroner. Annualized? That's 2,300. He needed 15,000. Assets: 4,000 crowns in outstanding loans. The insurance pool was 630. The land was fully mortgaged. Net assets were approaching zero. He was falling behind catastrophically. He needed a breakthrough. Not gradual growth, but a leap. And Cassell knew exactly what it was. Fictitious debts. 23 sheets in a leather folder under the floorboard. 120,000 crowns in attributed liabilities. If he could prove that 3 of the 12 debts were fictitious, that would remove 25,000 crowns from the balance sheet. 25,000 would shift from the negative to zero. Plus, the land freed from encumbrances would become net assets. The Ronswood lands were worth 18,000. The Cassandra lands, 12,000. The Verhagen estates were worth 32,000. If the fictitious debt is removed from these 3 estates, the net assets will rise to 62,000. That's more than what's required for the audit, but this requires a court ruling, or at least an official review. And for a review, evidence is needed that the commission will accept. Marilyn's copies were made from memory. They have no legal standing. We need the originals, or certified copies, or testimony from someone who has seen the actual ledgers. Marilyn has seen them, but her word against Celeste Ballios is worth nothing in court. A former employee against the landlady. No one will believe her. Cassell sat at the table, deep in thought. Marilyn sat across from him. She said there was another way, not court, but an audit. The Royal Commission, which would arrive in 40 days, had the right to request the original debt instruments from the creditors. If Cassell filed a formal objection to the 3 debts, the Commission would be obligated to investigate. It's obligated to request the books from Valio, and then Valio would be faced with a choice: show the real books and get caught, or forge them.
Cassell asked, "What if they forge them?" Marilyn smiled. For the first time in all these days, she said that this was exactly why they had So-Yun. Cassell understood. So-Yun had seen the original records. So-Yun had memorized every stroke, every correction, every slant of the letters. If Valio submits a forgery to the commission, So would be able to prove it was a forgery, because her memory was perfect, because she was the only person in the kingdom who could distinguish Valio's original handwriting from a copy. It was a weapon, subtle, fragile, dangerous. It required So-Yun to speak publicly, before the commission, before people, for the first time in 3 years. Cassell went to see So-Yun. She was sitting at her desk in her room, rewriting the bank's charter for the 6th time. Each copy was identical to the previous one. Cassell sat down across from her and explained the plan. So-Yun listened without looking up from the paper. Her hand didn't waver. She kept writing while he spoke. When he finished, she set down her pen. She looked at him. Her face was calm, but Cassell saw the numbers. Honor, 89. Favor, 25. And something new. Fear. Not a scale, not a number. Just a shadow in her eyes that the system couldn't measure. So-Yun said she would do it, in one word. I will. Then she picked up the pen again and continued writing. Day 52. Cassell filed an official objection regarding 3 debts. The Ronswood house, 8,000 kroner in fictitious debt. The Cassandra house, 5,000. The Verhagen house, 12,000. A total of 25,000 krone. He wrote the objection in duplicate. So-Yun copied both exactly down to the last period. Marilyn verified the calculations. Cassell affixed the ardent seal. a dull tin seal that glowed a little brighter with each passing day. The system confirmed it. The seal's power grows with the owner's honor. Castle's honor had risen from 14 to 31 in 50 days. Every loan repaid, every dispute resolved, every promise kept. His honor grew slowly but surely. A messenger carried the objection to the capital. Now all that remained was to wait and to work. 38 days. Castle shifted his focus to revenue. Even if net assets rose to $62,000 by writing off fictitious debts, he needed an annual income of $15,000,
$2,300 at the current exchange rate. He needed to increase it 6.5 times in 38 days. Castle decided to launch 3 new ventures. First, the Ardent Pharmacy. Hannah knew herbs. She could prepare medicines, ointments, and decoctions. Low production costs, high markup. Everyone needs medicine. Second, Ardent Forge. Ayla knew how to forge. The Ronswoods blacksmith's yard had been confiscated, but there was an old forge in the castle, small, with a cracked anvil, but it was still functional. Third, a notary's office. Soyan could certify documents, copy contracts, and maintain a registry of transactions. There wasn't a single notary within a 50-mile radius. The nearest one was in the capital. Hannah got started first. She had already been going around the villages conducting inspections. Now she began selling. Mint tea for headaches, 5 crowns per bottle. Ointment for joints, 8 crowns. Cough syrup, 6 crowns. In the first week, she sold 42 crowns worth. Not much, but it was a start. Castle set aside a former storage room for her to use as a pharmacy. Hannah arranged the glass bottles on the shelves. She hung bunches of herbs from the ceiling. The room smelled of mint and sage. Hannah's favor remained unchanged. 21. Steady. Hannah didn't need favor. She needed work. It was more complicated with Ayla. Castle came to her on the 53rd day and suggested opening a blacksmith shop. Ayla was standing by the window, looking out at the courtyard. She didn't turn around. She said that the blacksmith shop in the castle wasn't a blacksmith shop at all, but a hole with a forge, that the anvil was cracked, that there was no coal, no iron, and no tools, that she wouldn't be shoeing peasant horses. She was a blacksmith and armorer. She made blades, not nails. Castle said he understood. He asked what she needed to get started. Ayla finally turned around. She listed her needs. A new anvil, 300 pounds of coal, 50 pounds of good iron, a 4-pound hammer, tongs, a chisel, a hardening vat. Total cost, about 400 crowns. Castle didn't have 400 crowns, but he had a blacksmith named Barg. Castle proposed a barter. Barg would share his tools and coal. Ayla would teach his son a technique known only to the Ronswoods, for free of charge. In exchange for resources, Barg agreed instantly. His son Markle dreamed of becoming a blacksmith, but Barg knew only rough work, horseshoes, nails, hinges. The Ronswoods forged weapons. That was a different craft, a different level. Ayla agreed reluctantly. She didn't want to teach. She wanted to forge. But Cassell said that one didn't get in the way of the other. Ayla looked at him with that look he was already beginning to recognize. Not hatred, not distrust, something in between. She said she'd start tomorrow. Day 55. That night, Cassell went down to the courtyard. He couldn't sleep. Numbers were spinning in his head. Income, expenses, deadlines, interest rates. He stood under the stars, breathing in the cold air. A fire was burning behind the castle wall. The forge. Cassell walked around the wall and peered through the window. Ayla was standing at the forge, alone, without Markle, without Bard. She was forging. Her hands moved precisely and quickly. Her left hand held a red-hot rod with tongs. Her right hand struck it with a hammer. Her scorched right hand, That very one. The scar from her father's forge stood out white against the red glow of the fire. She didn't notice Cassell. She was in her own world, a world where steel speaks and people are silent. Cassell didn't go inside. He returned to the door and set a mug of tea on the threshold, the cooling mint tea that Hannah left in the kitchen every evening. Then he left. In the morning, the mug was empty. Isla didn't say a word. Her favor hadn't changed. 6. But the mug was empty. The 57th day. The notary's office was up and running. Soyan sat at a table by the castle entrance. A quill, ink, a stack of blank paper, a sign written in her own hand. Document certification, contract copying, transaction registry. The first client arrived 3 hours later, a merchant from a neighboring village. He needed to have a contract for the sale of a herd of goats notarized. Usually, this required a trip to the capital, a 2-day journey, an overnight stay, and a 50 krona fee to the notary. Soyan charged 10. The merchant left satisfied. The next day, 2 more came, then 4. By the 60th day, Soyan was serving 3 or 4 clients a day. 10 crowns for certification, 5 for a copy, 20 for drafting a contract. Income from the notary office for the first 10 days, 280 crowns. Cassell did the math. Hannah's pharmacy, 42 crowns for the first week, then 60, then 80. Growth. Word was spreading. People were coming from neighboring villages for Hannah's ointments. Isla's blacksmith shop, still operating at a loss. Isla forged but didn't sell. She made knives, beautiful ones, sharp ones, engraved ones, but she refused to sell them for less than she considered fair. 40 crowns per knife. The peasants couldn't afford 40 crowns for a knife. Cassell didn't argue. He knew there was a market for Isla's knives, just not here, not in the village, in the city. Soyan's notary office, 280 crowns for 10 days, over 10,000 a year. This was serious, very serious. The 60th day, 1 month until the audit. Cassell sat at the table with Marilyn and balanced the books. Total revenue from the bank and businesses over 2 months. Bank interest, 420 crowns. The pharmacy, 182. The notary office, 280. Brokerage commissions, 105. Total, 987 crowns for 2 months. Annualized, that's 5,900. They needed 15,000. There had been growth, significant, but insufficient. Marilyn said that if they added the income from Isla's blacksmith shop and factored in the growth of the notary office's client base, they could reach 8,000 a year by the time of the audit. Castle shook his head. 8, not 15. Marilyn said there was another source. Castle looked at her. Marilyn said it was fictitious debt. If the commission accepted the objection and removed 25,000 in fictitious debt from the balance sheet, the interest paid on those debts would become an overpayment. The overpayment could be refunded or offset. The interest paid by the Ronswoods on 8,000 in fictitious debt over 3 years at a rate of 2% per month. Castle did the math in his head. Marilyn calculated it on paper. The figure turned out to be astronomical. If calculated using the compound interest formula, over 3 years the Ronswoods had overpaid more than 100,000 kroner on the fictitious portion of the debt. It was madness. But it was math. Of course, they wouldn't get the 100,000 back from Valio. The court might order a partial refund or a set-off, but even 10% of that amount was 10,000. 10,000 is 2 years' worth of the bank's income.
Marilyn pushed her glasses up onto her forehead and rubbed the bridge of her nose. She said that everything depended on whether the commission would accept the objection. If it did, they had a chance. If not, they'd lost. Day 61. A response to the objection arrived from the Capitol. A messenger delivered an envelope bearing two seals, the Treasury seal and the Chancellor's seal. Castle opened the envelope. The objection had been accepted for consideration. The Audit Commission was requesting the original debt instruments from the Mercer and Valeo houses. The deadline for submission was 30 days. The audit was postponed from the 89th day to the 99th to allow for the creditor's response. Castle reread it. Accepted. They will request the originals from Valeo. Valeo will have to provide them, or forge them, or refuse. Any of the three options worked in Castle's favor. If they provide the originals, the fictitious entries will come to light. If they forge them, Soyan will expose them. If they refuse, the commission will consider it an admission. The system beeped. A strategic decision. The legal objection was accepted by the government agency, plus 400 capital points. Total score, 3,600. Marilyn stood nearby, reading over his shoulder. She nodded. She said the first stage was complete. Now for the second. Prepare Soyan to appear before the commission. Castle agreed. He turned to walk toward Soyan and saw Adelina. She was standing at the end of the hallway. She had heard everything. Her face was inscrutable, but she was standing there. She wasn't hiding in her room. She stood there and listened. Castle nodded at her. Adelina didn't nod back, but she didn't leave either. Day 68. 22 days until the audit. Castle sat in the library and went over the projections. Revenue was growing. Soyan's notary office had stabilized at 30 crowns a day. Hannah's pharmacy was bringing in 12. Isla's blacksmith shop had finally brought in its first money, not from knives, but from locks. Castle had suggested the idea to Isla 3 days earlier. Not blades, locks. Ordinary iron locks for chests and gates. Low production costs. High demand. Every peasant wants to lock up their granary. Isla resisted for 2 days. She was a weaponsmith, not a locksmith. But Cassell said that a lock is also a weapon. Against thieves. Against tyranny. Against the fear that someone might take away what little they have left at night. Ayla looked at him for a long time. Then she said he had a way with words. Cassell replied that it was the only thing he was good at. Ayla snorted and began forging locks. The first 5 locks sold in 2 days, 15 crowns apiece, 75 crowns. Then 8 more. Then an order from a merchant in a neighboring village for 20 locks, 300 crowns. Ayla forged day and night. Markel helped. He pumped the bellows. He fed the coal. He tended the fire. Ayla taught him between hammer blows, not with words, with movements. Show me. Repeat. One more time. Better. Barg would come in the evenings and stand silently by the door. He watched as his son learned from a master of a caliber he could never even have dreamed of. The 70th day. Cassell was balancing the monthly books. Income for the 3rd month. Bank interest, 610 crowns. The notary's office, 900. The pharmacy, 420. The blacksmith shop, 450. Brokerage commissions, 230. And insurance premiums of 100 crowns from new members. Total, 2,710 crowns for the month. Annualized, 32,500. Castle reread the figure. 32,500. He needed 15,000. He had exceeded his quota by more than double. Marilyn checked the calculations. She found a mistake, not in Castle's, but in her own records. She had forgotten to account for the repayment of 2 loans that had come in late. With that correction, the annual income came to 33,000. Marilyn took off her glasses. She wiped them clean, put them back on. She said that for the first time in 5 years of working with numbers, she was looking at a balance sheet that didn't make her want to cry. Castle said this was just the beginning. Marilyn said she knew, but income is only half the audit. The other half is net assets, 60,000. Everything here depended on the objection regarding fictitious debts. If the commission accepted it, if Valeo provided the documents, if Soyan could testify. 3 conditions. Any one of them could fall through. Day 71. News arrived from the capital. Bad news. Baron Cram had sent a messenger. Valeo had filed a counterclaim. Not against Cassell, against Cram. They accused Cram of conspiring with Baron Ardent to evade his debt obligations.
The penalty, doubling the debt, 90,000 crowns instead of 45, and a demand for immediate payment. Cram was in a panic. His letter was written with a trembling hand. He begged Cassell for help. Cassell reread the letter 3 times. The Valios weren't playing defense. They were on the offensive. They had struck at the weakest link, Cram, not Cassell, the man who had agreed to cooperate with him. The message was clear: anyone who sided with Ardent would be punished. Cassell thought about it for a full day. On the 72nd day, he wrote a reply to Cram. He said that Valio's counterclaim was illegal, that there was no law prohibiting 2 barons from conducting joint business activities, that a charge of conspiracy required evidence of intent to evade the law, and Cram wasn't evading. He was paying, at the new rate,
3%, which had been agreed upon through Ardent Bank. Cassell attached a copy of the partnership agreement certified by Soyon. He told Cram to file a response to the lawsuit and wait. He said that if the case went to trial, he would personally act as his defense attorney. Marilyn said it was dangerous, that the Valios might turn their attention to Cassell if he stuck his neck out. Cassell replied that the Valios were already watching him, that hiding was pointless, that the only strategy was to get bigger, not to hide, but to grow. As long as you're small, you can be crushed quietly. When you're big, you can only be crushed loudly. And loudly means publicly. And publicly means before the commission. And before the commission means according to the law. Marilyn shook her head. She said that Valio doesn't always play by the rules. Cassell nodded. He knew. Day 74. 16 days until the audit. An unexpected guest arrived at the castle. Not Felix. Not a Valio spy. A young woman riding a gray mare, well-dressed, with a haughty face and cold gray eyes. She introduced herself as Vivian Mercer, the daughter of Lord Augustine Mercer. Cassell looked at the numbers. Credit, 51. Debt, 0. Favor, not applicable. She wasn't a bride. She was an emissary. Vivian said her father was concerned, that he'd heard about Cassell's objection regarding fictitious debts, that if the commission found fictitious debts with Valio, it might start investigating the Mercers as well, and the Mercers, too, had records that wouldn't stand up to close scrutiny. Cassell listened. Vivian continued. She said her father was proposing a deal. The Mercers would support Cassell's objection against Valio, publicly, at the audit. In exchange, Cassell would not file a similar objection against the Mercers. Ever. Cassell thought. It was a temptation. The Mercers' support at the audit meant that the commission would receive not only Soyon's testimony, but also confirmation from the second largest creditor. The Mercers would testify against Valio. It was powerful, almost irresistible. But the price. A promise never to touch the Mercers, never to audit their books, never to pursue their fictitious debts. The system was silent. It offered no guidance in such situations. Cassell made the decision himself. He told Vivian that he could not make a promise of never, that it was too long a word for a baron with a 90-day planning horizon, but he could promise not to file an objection against the Mercers for 2 years. During that time, Lord Mercer could put his books in order, voluntarily, without coercion. Vivian looked at him. Then she smiled, a small, predatory smile that reminded Cassell of Lord Mercer. She said she would pass the proposal on to her father, and she left. 3 days later, the reply arrived. Mercer agreed. A 2-year moratorium in exchange for public support at the audit. Cassell signed. The system beeped. Strategic alliance, plus 500 points. Total score, 4,600. 400 to go until the public bond. Day 78, 12 days until the audit. Cassell woke up to a scream, not human, a horse's. He bolted out into the yard. The stable was on fire. Not the whole thing, just one corner. Flames were licking at the rafters, and smoke rose in a black column into the morning sky. Yona was already inside. She was pulling the horses out. 2 had broken free and were galloping around the yard. A third was limping. A 4th wouldn't come out. Yona shouted that it was tied up. Cassell rushed into the smoke. He found the horse. He cut the rope with his knife, the very same knife engraved with Ardent that Isla had left him. The horse bolted out of the stable, nearly knocking him off his feet. Cassell fell to the ground and began coughing. The smoke filled his lungs. Isla and Barg were putting out the fire, with buckets, Mei Lin organized a bucket brigade from the well. Hana prepared wet rags for those who had inhaled smoke. An hour later, the fire was extinguished. A corner of the stable had burned out. One wall had collapsed. 2 horses had suffered burns. The 4th was limping on its left front leg. Yona sat on the ground and cried, not out of grief, but out of anger. She said the fire wasn't an accident. She had found a rag soaked in oil at the base of the wall. Arson. Castle examined the rag. Ordinary rags. Lamp oil. Cheap, easily available. No traces other than the rag itself. Castle looked at the gate. Barg's new hinges were intact. The lock on the gate was undamaged. So someone had climbed over the wall, at night, quietly, set the stable on fire and left. Why? Not to destroy the castle. The fire was too small for that. 1 rag, 1 corner. It was a warning. Marilyn walked over and whispered that it was Valio. Cassell nodded. He'd thought so himself. 12 days until the audit. They were on edge. The objection regarding the fictitious debts had been accepted. The Mercers had sided with Cassell. Cram was holding his ground. Valio was losing control. And now they'd moved from paper attacks to physical ones. Arson. A warning. Next time it might not be the stable, but the library, or the pharmacy, or the castle itself. Cassell gathered everyone in the great hall. 12 brides. Barg, Markle. Everyone stood there with soot on their faces and smoke in their hair. Cassell said that the arson was a sign that they were on the right path, that the enemy doesn't burn the homes of those they don't fear. Ayla said that pretty words wouldn't put out the next fire. Cassell agreed. He said they needed security, a wall, a guard, and locks. Good locks on every door. Ayla looked at him. He looked at her. She nodded. She already knew what he meant. In 3 days, Ayla forged 18 locks. Ordinary ones, not magical. For magical steel, she needed time and materials she didn't have yet. But the Ronswood's ordinary locks were better than any others in the area. A precise fit, a complex mechanism, 4 pins instead of 2. She marked each lock with the Ronswood family brand, a hammer and an anvil. Castle hung the locks on every door, the stable, the library, the apothecary, the storeroom, the smithy, every room. Barg volunteered to stand guard at night. So did his son, Markle. The peasant Olt brought his 2 sons, voluntarily, without pay. He said the Baron had helped him with a debt, and he wanted to help in return. The system beeped. Voluntary assistance, plus 200 points. Total, 4,800, up to 5,200. Castle was counting. 200 points. He needed 1 more step, 1 act of trust, 1 debt repaid, and the public bond would be unlocked. Day 81, 9 days until the audit. Thorn repaid the loan. That same Thorn from Honor 36, 200 crowns for seeds. He came to the bank with a small bag of coins. 208 crowns with interest. He said the wheat had sprouted, that the field was fully sown, that the harvest would be in the fall, that his girlfriend had returned. He said the last part quietly and quickly. Marilyn recorded the repayment. Castle looked at the numbers above Thorn's head. Honor, 44. It had been 36. Plus 8. Repaying the loan had raised his honor by 8 points. The young man who hadn't believed in himself 3 months ago was standing before him with his back straight and his eyes clear. The system beeped. Plus 100 points. Total score, 4,900. Another 100. And that very same day, the last of the overdue loans was repaid. Farmer Dalt, 70 crowns. He was 3 weeks late. He apologized. He said he'd been sick. Castle looked at his honor rating. 41. An honest man who simply hadn't made it in time. Marilyn recorded it. Plus 50. 4,950. Castle sighed. Another 50. They arrived in the evening, not from the farmer, not from the refund, from Adelina. She knocked on the library door. Castle opened the door. Adelina stood before him in the same impeccable dress she'd worn when she arrived 3 months ago. Only now it was slightly worn at the elbows. She handed him a sheet of paper. Castle took it. It was a list. 3 names. 3 of Chancellor Hallstrom's agents at court. The very ones the system had mentioned when Adelina's favor reached 10. She knew the names, but didn't understand their value. Now she was giving them to Castle. She said she'd decided to help him, not because she trusted him, because he was the only one who told her the truth about her family's debt. She said trust would come, or it might not, but the truth had already happened, and the truth must be repaid with the truth. Castle took the list. 3 names, 3 threads leading to the Chancellor. He hid the list in a secret compartment. The system beeped.
Voluntary transfer of strategic information. Plus 100 points. 5,000. A new panel unfolded in his mind. Financial instrument unlocked. Public bond. Description. Issuance of the barony's debt obligations for public sale. Buyers receive a fixed percentage of income. The barony receives capital for development. Minimum issuance, 5,000 crowns. Maximum determined by the issuer's honor. Castle's honor is 35. Maximum issuance, 35,000 crowns. 35,000. That's enough to buy out Cram's debt to Valio at a discount.
That's enough to expand the bank to cover 3 villages. That's enough to build a storage facility, to build a warehouse based on Mei Lin's blueprints, to purchase materials for magical steel. Castle closed his eyes. 5,000 points, 3 months of work, 100 small decisions, 100 debts repaid, 100 handshakes, 100 cups of tea. And now he could print money. Not literally, but almost. A bond is trust turned into paper, and he had enough trust. Day 83. 7 days until the audit. Castle announced the issuance of the first ardent bond. 1,000 crowns. Not 35,000. 1,000. He started small. 100 bonds at 10 crowns each. A 5% annual yield, 1-year term, secured by the revenues of Ardent Bank and the insurance pool. He posted a notice in 3 villages. Marilyn drafted a 2-page prospectus in plain language, without any legal jargon. You give us 10 crowns. In a year, you'll get 10 crowns and 50 pennies. Your money works while you sleep. The first buyers showed up the next day. Barg bought 3 bonds, 30 crowns. Old Woman Pill bought 1. Miller Graham bought 2. Merchant Hell bought 5. He came in with a sly look in his eyes and asked, "What if the bank closes?" Castle replied that, in that case, the bonds were secured by the lands of the 12 clans. Hell nodded. 50 crowns. By the 85th day, all 100 bonds had been sold. 1,000 crowns. Real money. The first public bond issue of the Barony of Ardent. The system beeped. The first public bond had been successfully placed. Plus 300 points. New status, Baron Banker. Castle stood in the courtyard, holding a leather pouch containing 1,000 crowns. It wasn't his money. It was the money of people who had trusted him. It was heavier than any debt. The 86th day. 4 days until the audit. Castle was preparing the documents. Marilyn was drafting the report. Soyan was making 3 copies. Clarissa was checking the math. Hannah was preparing a report on the insurance pool. Isla was forging the last batch of locks to sell before the audit. Rowena was calculating logistics routes. Yona was compiling an inventory of horses and equestrian equipment. Mei Lin was drafting plans for the castle's expansion. Tai He was packing glass vials for the apothecary. Bridget was preparing food for everyone working around the clock. Lyra was singing, not for an audience but for the castle, quiet melodies that helped her think. The carriage stopped at the gate. Cassell stood in the courtyard next to with Isla. His hands were steady. His heart was not. The first man stepped out of the carriage. A heavy-set man in the treasury's robe, a seal on his chest, a gold chain around his neck. It was the chief auditor, Lord Benedict Grau. Cassell looked at the numbers. Honor 62. Not bad for a bureaucrat, not corrupt, or not yet bought. His assistant stepped out second, a young man with a briefcase. Honor 45. The secretary stepped out third, a woman in her 30s with ink stains on her fingers. Honor 58. 3 officials, 20 guards, and a 4th person. Chancellor Anselm Hallstrom was the last to step out of the carriage. Slowly, carefully, every movement measured. He looked around and saw Cassell. His colorless eyes rested on him. 3 seconds, then they drifted on. To the castle, to the repaired gates, to the new locks on the doors, to the smoke rising from the blacksmith's forge, to the sign of the notary's office. The chancellor saw everything. He memorized everything. Honor 9. It hadn't changed in 3 months. 9, consistently at the bottom. Castle bowed. He said he was pleased to welcome the commission, though he hadn't expected it before the scheduled date. The Chancellor smiled a faint smile and said that the Treasury had the right to conduct an audit on any day within the designated period, that it was standard practice. Castle knew that was a lie. Standard practice required 3 days' notice, but there was no point in arguing. They were here. The audit was starting now. Marilyn showed up 10 minutes later, fully dressed, with a folder in her hands, glasses on her nose. She'd made it in time. Castle didn't know how, but the documents were ready, all of them, because Marilyn had finished them 2 days ago. Because Marilyn always finished early. She'd told him on his second day on the job that a good accountant submits a report a day before the deadline, because bad news always comes the day before. She was right. The great hall. A table, chairs. Lord Grau sat at the head, the assistant to his right, the secretary to his left. The Chancellor sat separately,
off to the side. As an observer, he wasn't part of the commission. He was a guest, one who could become the executioner at any moment. Castle sat across from Grau, Marilyn next to him. Behind them stood the brides, not all of them. Adelina, Soyon, Hannah, Clarissa, Ayla by the wall. The rest were waiting upstairs. Lord Grau opened the session. He read out the requirements: annual income of at least 15,000 crowns, net assets of at least 60,000, proof of solvency for all current obligations. He asked if Baron Ardent was ready to present the documents. Castle said he was ready. Marilyn opened the folder. First section, income. Marilyn read aloud. Bank interest from microloans, annual income 7,300 crowns. Notary office, annual total 10,800. Pharmacy, annual total 5,040. Blacksmithing, annual total 5,400. Commission income, annual total 2,760. Insurance premiums, annual total 1,200. Total 32,500 crowns in annual income. Lord Grau raised his eyebrows. The assistant stopped writing and looked at Marilyn. The secretary was checking the figures on her sheet. The Chancellor did not move, but his eyes narrowed. Grau asked for supporting documents. Marilyn handed over a stack. A loan register with the borrower's signatures, records of repayments, interest calculations based on Clarissa's formula, a list of notary services with dates and amounts. Every document was certified by Soyon. Every figure was verified by Clarissa. Every signature was authentic. Grau studied the documents for 40 minutes. He asked questions. Why was the interest rate 4% and not 10%? Castle replied that at 4% the return was 80%. At 10% it would have been 50%. 4% with an 80% return yields more than 10% with a 50% return. Grau looked at him for a long time. Then he asked how the Baron knew such things. Castle replied that he had read a great deal. Section 2. Assets. This is where the most difficult part began. Land belonging to 12 families. Estimated value 180,000 crowns. Encumbrances, debt obligations. Castle filed an objection regarding 3 fictitious debts. Grau read it. The assistant read it. The secretary read it. The Chancellor sat up straight in his chair. Grau said that the objection was serious,
that the commission the originals from Valio, that Valio had provided the documents 2 days ago. He took 3 sheets of paper out of his folder. The the original records of the Ronswood, Cassandra, and Verhagen debts. Castle looked at Marilyn. Marilyn looked at Soyan. Soyan stepped forward. She picked up the first sheet, the Ronswood's debt. Her hands didn't tremble. She stared at the paper for 30 seconds. Then she placed the sheet on the table and spoke. In a quiet, steady voice that made the room fall silent, she said the document was a forgery, that the handwriting belonged to a Valio accountant named Rand Hollow. She recognized his handwriting. She had seen it hundreds of times in documents that passed through Valio's office. But the original entry for the Ronswood debt had been made by another accountant, a senior one, named Get. Get had a distinctive leftward slant when writing capital letters. Hollow's slant was to the right. On this sheet, the capital letters are slanted to the right. This isn't the original. It's a rewritten copy with an altered amount. The room was silent. Grawl looked at Soyan. The Chancellor looked at Soyan. Everyone looked at Soyan.
She stood upright in a white dress, her face impassive, and spoke words that could bring down the Valio Empire. She picked up the second sheet, Cassandra's debt. Same story, Hollow's handwriting, not Get's, slanted to the right, a forged copy. The third sheet, Verhagen's debt. Here, Soyan paused. She looked at the paper for longer, a minute, two. Then she said that this document was more complicated, that someone had tried to imitate Get's handwriting, slanted to the left. Correct, but there was one detail. Get always put a period after the numbers, after every number. That was his habit. On this sheet, the periods appear only after the total amounts. A forgery. Grau turned to the Chancellor. He asked if a representative from Valio was present. The Chancellor said no, that Valio had provided the documents via courier. Grau frowned. He said that the witness's testimony was convincing, that the Commission would recommend an independent examination of the originals in Valio's vault. Until the examination is complete, the disputed amounts will be excluded from the calculation of Baron Ardent's liabilities. Castle did the math. 25,000 in fictitious debt removed.
The Ronswood estates unblocked, 18,000 in net assets. The Cassandra estates, 12,000. The Verhagen estates, 32,000. A total of 62,000 crowns in net assets. More than 60,000. The threshold had been met. The morning of the 90th day, Castle stood by the library window and watched as the Commission's carriage drove off down the road toward the capital. Dust rose behind the wheels and settled on the grass. The Chancellor had left first, just yesterday, immediately after the results were announced. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't stay the night. He just got into the carriage and left. His face was a mask. His honor was 9. Nothing had changed. Nothing was supposed to change. People with an honor of 9 don't change. They seek revenge. Castle turned away from the window. Marilyn was sitting at the table. She was already working, glasses on her nose, a pen in her hand. She was drawing up a plan for the next 3 months. Castle sat down across from her. Marilyn looked up. She said there was no time to celebrate, that the audit was over, but the debt of 250,000 hadn't gone anywhere.
That the monthly payments to Mercer were continuing, that Valio wouldn't forget the exposure, that the Chancellor wouldn't forget the humiliation. Castle nodded. He knew all of this. Marilyn said they needed to expand, quickly, before their enemies could regroup. Breakfast. 13 people at the table. Bridget had made pancakes, honey from old woman pill, Hannah's mint tea. It was unusually quiet at the table, not tense, but calm. The silence of people who had learned yesterday that they would not die. Clarissa ate in silence and jotted something down in the margins of her notebook. Tehi twirled a new glass vial in her hands. Yona fed bread to the stray dog that had shown up a week ago and stayed. Rowena was sketching a map of river routes on the back of a napkin. Lyra quietly hummed a melody without words. Isla sat next to Castle, not across from him, next to him. It was the first time. She didn't speak. She ate a pancake and looked out the window, but she sat next to him. Castle noticed but didn't let on. Some things don't need to be commented on. They just need to be accepted. Adelina sat at the far end of the table. She ate neatly, in small bites, with her back straight.
But she was eating, and when Bridget asked if anyone wanted seconds, Adelina nodded. It was the first time in 3 months she'd asked for seconds. Favorability,
17. It had risen from 14 over the past few days of the audit. Castle finished eating and stood up. He said he had an announcement to make. Everyone looked at him. He said the audit had been passed, that the bank was operational, that the barony was thriving, but that this was only the beginning, that the next step was expansion. He said he planned to issue a second series of bonds, not 1,000 crowns, 10,000. He said he planned to open a second branch of the bank in the village of Cram, a third in the nearby town of Martinburg. He said they needed people for this, branch managers. He looked at Hannah. She looked at him. He said that one of her students could run the pharmacy in Martinburg. Hannah nodded. He looked at Rowena. He said that logistics for deliveries between the 3 locations was her job. Rowena picked up her napkin with the map on it and waved it. It's already done. Castle smiled. He looked at Ayla. He said he needed a safe. A real one. Fireproof. Unbreakable.
For storing bonds, documents, and cash. He said he knew there was an alloy that couldn't be opened without a blacksmith's blood. Ayla froze. Her hand, holding a pancake, stopped halfway to her mouth. She looked at Castle for a long time. Then she asked how he knew. Castle said he'd guessed. Ayla set her plate down on the table. She said that magical steel required a rare component, moonstone, a mineral mined only in the mines of Velt County. 1 pound costs 100 crowns. 5 pounds are needed for the safe. 500 crowns. Castle said the money would be there. Ayla said she'd believe it when she saw it. Noon on the 90th day. Castle stepped out into the courtyard. The sun was high in the sky. The gate gleamed with new hinges. The stable had been repaired. Mei Lin was overseeing the construction of a new warehouse by the eastern wall. The foundation had already been laid. Taehi was carrying a basket of vials to the pharmacy. Markle was pumping the bellows in the blacksmith's shop. Barg was hammering away at something heavy behind the wall. The village below went about its business as usual, but now there was something different about it. Sound, rhythm.
The clang of hammers, the creak of wheels, the voices of people at work. They weren't just surviving, they were working. 3 months ago, there had been the silence of a dying estate. Now there was the sound of a new beginning. Castle stood in the courtyard, doing the math in his head. 10,000 crowns for bonds, 15,000 to pay off Cram's debt, 500 for the moonstone, 3,000 to expand the bank in Martinburg, 1,000 for pharmacy equipment, 2,000 for building the vault. Total, 31,500. He had 1,000 crowns from the first bond issue. Income from the bank and businesses over 3 months was about 3,000, 4,000 in cash. He still needed 27,000. A lot, but not impossible. No longer impossible. He thought about the Valios. They'd been silent for 3 days. After the audit, after the forgeries were exposed. Silence. That was bad. The Valios don't stay silent when they're losing. They stay silent when they're planning. Marilyn said the same thing yesterday. She said the Valios' silence was like the calm before the storm, that she'd worked for them for 5 years and knew. When Celeste Valio falls silent, it means she's calculating. And when she finishes calculating, someone pays. Noon turned into day, day into evening. Castle worked. He wrote letters to Baron Krum about the expansion plan, to the merchants of Martinburg about the new bank branch, to 3 noble houses that, according to Marilyn, were on the verge of bankruptcy, with a restructuring proposal. He showed every letter to Marilyn. Marilyn checked the numbers. So Yun neatly copied them out. An assembly line. A small, creaky assembly line of 3 people that produced more documents than the office of any other county. Evening. Sunset. Castle sat alone in the library. Everyone had gone to bed. Only So-Yun was still working in her room. He saw the light under her door as he walked past. She always worked late, silently, meticulously, without complaint. Castle thought that if he had to name one person without whom the bank couldn't survive, it would be So-Yun. Not Marilyn with her brains, not Isla with her hands. So-Yun, because every document passed through her fingers, every contract, every copy, every certification. She was the foundation upon which everything else stood. And she did it in silence. 3 years of silence. And then the voice that exposed Valio's forgeries before the commission. Castle committed it to memory. Quiet people often shoulder the most important burdens. A knock at the gate. Loud, insistent. Castle jumped up. He ran downstairs. Barg was already standing at the gate with a torch. Markle was behind him with a hammer. A man stood outside the gate, alone, without a horse, on foot, drenched in sweat. He was bent double, gasping for air. Baron Kram, in person. He had come on foot, a half-day's journey, without an entourage, without a horse. His horse had collapsed along the way. Castle opened the gate. Kram entered and fell to his knees.
Not out of weakness, out of despair. He said that Valio had taken his castle. This morning, 20 men in black. They arrived at dawn. They presented a confiscation order, signed by Chancellor Hallstrom, his own signature, his own seal. Baron Cram was no longer a baron. His lands were now Valio's property. His wife was staying at his sister's house in a neighboring village. His servants had been dismissed. Everything, overnight. Castle stood and watched the heavy-set man on his knees.
Cram was crying, unashamedly, openly. That's how people cry when they have nothing left to lose. Castle crouched down beside him. He said that Cram would get back on his feet, that Cram would live at Ardent Castle, that his wife would too, that the confiscation ordered by the Chancellor could be challenged in the small council, that the order was signed by the Chancellor, not the king, that the monarch's signature was required to confiscate noble property. That was the law. Article 214 of the Property Code. The Chancellor had overstepped his authority. Cram raised his tear-stained eyes. He asked if it was true. Castle said it was, that the Chancellor had signed the order without the king's knowledge, because he was in a hurry, because he wanted to punish Cram before Castle could intervene, and in his haste he made a mistake. Marilyn was standing in the doorway. She had heard everything. She said that to file an appeal with the small council, they needed the votes of 3 noble houses. Castle had the votes of 12 houses through marriage, plus Cram's vote, 13 votes, more than enough. Castle nodded. He said that they would draft the appeal in the morning, that Soyan would certify it, that Marilyn would calculate the damages, that Adelina— He paused. Adelina was standing on the stairs. She had come down because of the noise. She was listening. Cassell looked at her. He said that Adelina knew how the small council worked, that she'd studied under the Chancellor for 2 years, that she knew the procedures. Adelina was silent. Then she nodded. Once, briefly. She said she knew, and that she'd explain in the morning. Day 92. Cassell sat at a table in the library and dictated the text of the appeal to Soyan. Marilyn stood nearby and corrected the wording. Adelina sat in an armchair by the window and listened. She didn't interfere. She waited. When Cassell finished, she spoke, in a quiet, even voice that sounded like a blade against stone. She said that the appeal was drafted correctly, but would be filed incorrectly. Cassell asked what she meant. Adelina said that the small council meets once a month. The next session is in 18 days. If the appeal is filed through the usual channels via the Chancellor's office, the Chancellor will delay it. He'll set it aside. He'll lose it. He'll postpone its consideration. The Chancellor has 1,000 ways to bury a document without reading it. Castle asked what the unusual route was. Adelina said there was Article 31 of the Code of Noble Rights, a direct appeal to the Crown. Any noble has the right to personally present a petition to the king at the Grand Audience. The Grand Audience takes place every Friday. It's open to any titled person. The Chancellor can't interfere because the reception is public. The court will be watching. The press will be listening. If Castle presents the appeal to the king in person in front of witnesses, the Chancellor won't be able to bury it. Marilyn said that it's dangerous, that the Chancellor will be at the reception, that he'll try to stop Castle before he reaches the throne. Adelina nodded. She said that's exactly why Castle won't go alone. He'll go with her. The daughter of the Marquis of Verhagen has the right to stand in the front row. The Chancellor wouldn't dare push the Marquis's daughter aside in front of the court. That would be a scandal he couldn't afford. Castle looked at Adelina. Favorability, 19. It had been growing imperceptibly. A little bit every day, like ice melting from the edges. He asked why she was helping. Adelina didn't answer right away. She looked out the window. Then she said that the Chancellor had spent 2 years teaching her to be perfect. The perfect wife, the perfect doll. He chose her because she was beautiful, smart, and obedient. He didn't know that she had memorized his every word, every lesson, every tactic. He taught her how power works. He didn't teach her to be loyal to him. That was his mistake. Castle thought that the Chancellor made a lot of mistakes for a man who considered himself infallible. The 95th day, Castle and Adelina rode to the capital on horseback. Soyan gave him 3 copies of the appeal, identical, just in case one was taken away. Marilyn stayed at the castle to run the bank. Hannah stayed with the pharmacy. Ayla was forging. Clarissa was counting. Lyra was singing. The castle functioned without Castle. That was important.
It meant he had built not a company dependent on its founder, but a system that ran on its own. Marilyn told him this before they left. She said that if he were killed in the capital, the bank would survive for at least half a year. Castle said it was the gloomiest compliment he'd ever received.
The journey to the capital took 3 days. Castle rode in silence. Adelina rode beside him, also in silence. They didn't speak for the first half of the day. Then Adelina spoke up. She asked if Castle knew that the Chancellor had poisoned his father. Castle said he suspected as much. Adelina said she didn't suspect, she knew. She had seen it. Not the moment itself, but she had seen the Chancellor hand a vial to a man in Baron Tobias's entourage, a week before his death. She hadn't known then what was in the vial. Now she knows. Castle remained silent. He rode on in silence, staring at the road. Inside him, 2 memories were at war. Julian the analyst, who saw this as yet another trump card for the trial, and Castle the son, who wanted to turn his horse around and ride to the Chancellor with that very knife engraved with ardent. Julian won out. Not because he was stronger, because he was in the right. Revenge is not a strategy. Revenge is a drain. Day 97. The capital, the city of Cronville. Castle saw it for the first time through Castle's eyes, and at the same time, remembered it through the memories of others. A large, noisy, dirty city with stone walls and thousands of people. Numbers glowed above each one. Honor, debt, thousands of small tragedies recorded in numbers. A merchant with an honor of 52 and a debt of 3,000. A laundress with an honor of 70 and 0 debt. A guard at the gate with an honor of 14. A beggar on the bridge with an honor of 83, higher than that of most nobles. The 100th day, 10 days after the audit. Castle returned to the castle and found a letter. It was lying on his desk in the library, not in an envelope, just a folded sheet of paper. No one saw who brought it. Marilyn discovered it that morning when she came to work. Castle unfolded it. The handwriting was unfamiliar, neat and impersonal, written with the left hand, or the right, but with deliberate distortion. The text was brief. Baron Ardent, your bank is impressive. Your audacity is even more impressive. But you're playing a game you didn't invent. The book was written before you, and the author wasn't so naive. There was no signature. Instead, there was a symbol, the letter X inside a circle. Castle reread it 3 times. The book, the author, Master X, someone knew. Someone knew the connection between Castle and the book he had written in another life. Trust as Currency, a book that had existed in this world for 200 years. Castle took the Chancellor's letter to Mercer out of its hiding place. He looked at the handwriting. It didn't match. It wasn't the Chancellor. It was someone else. Someone who knew more than the Chancellor, more than Mercer, more than anyone. Marilyn walked into the library. She saw Castle's face and asked what had happened. Castle showed her the letter. Marilyn read it. She took off her glasses, then she put them back on. She said that in her 5 years working for Valio, she'd heard the name Master X only once. Celeste had said it one night in her office when she thought she was alone. Marilyn had been eavesdropping. It was a habit, a professional quirk of an accountant who works for people she doesn't trust. Celeste had said that Master X had returned, that it had been 2 years ago, long before Castle had arrived in this world. Marilyn hadn't understood it then. Now she was beginning to understand. Castle put the letter away. He decided he'd deal with Master X later. There were more important matters at hand right now. The Chancellor. Adelina had said he'd strike within a week. 3 days had passed. Silence. On the 4th day, the silence ended. The 114th day. Bailiffs arrived at the castle. Not just one, 20 of them, on horseback, with papers. The senior bailiff handed Cassell a stack of documents as thick as a finger. A new lawsuit, from the Valio Guild. The amount, 400,000 crowns. The grounds, breach of the terms of the original loan agreement, the clause prohibiting sublending. Valio claimed that Cassell, using the restructured debt as a basis, had issued microloans to third parties. In their view, this constituted sublending, which is prohibited under the standard agreement. The penalty was twice the principal amount of the debt. 250,000 multiplied by 2, 500,000. minus the debt already accounted for. Total, 400,000 kroner in the new claim. Cassell read it. He reread it.
He found the key phrase, on lending of funds received under a restructured obligation. Valio claimed that the money Cassell lent to the farmers was the same money he had saved through the restructuring with Mercer, that the restructuring had provided him with liquidity, which he had redirected toward lending, and that this was prohibited by the contract. Day 110. Cassell sent 4 letters in a single day. The first letter was to the Kronville Herald, the capital's only print publication. Attached to the letter was a copy of the Chancellor's letter to Mercer, demanding an increase in the interest rate for the Ronswoods. Soyan made a perfect copy. The second letter was addressed to the Royal Chancery of Justice. Attached to it were 23 pages of evidence of fictitious debts from Valio's books. The third letter was addressed to the Privy Council. It contained a list of the Chancellor's 3 agents at court, along with a description of their activities. The fourth letter was addressed to the King personally, via Vivian Mercer, Lord Mercer's daughter. Cassell had asked her to deliver it. The letter contained Adelina's testimony regarding the poisoning of Baron Tobias.
4 strikes, simultaneously, in 4 directions. Marilyn said he was crazy. Cassell said that in this world, the mad live longer than the cautious. Marilyn had no rebuttal. The first reaction came 3 days later. The Kronville Herald published an article, not on the front page, on the second page, but it was published. Chancellor Hallström used creditors to put pressure on the noble houses. The publication sent shockwaves through the capital. Every nobleman who had a loan from the Mercers or Valio began to wonder. Each asked himself whether his interest rate had been raised on the Chancellor's orders. Trust in Hallström began to crack. A small crack, but a visible one. The second reaction came 5 days later. The Office of Justice launched an investigation. 23 pages were handed over to 3 investigators. They requested access to Valio's vault. Valio refused. The investigators received a warrant, not from the Chancellor, from the King. That very same King Anselm, who had been signing everything presented to him, suddenly began reading documents before signing them. The public rebuke of the Chancellor had made an impression on him. He realized that not everything Hallström submitted deserved his signature. The third reaction. The small council summoned 3 of the Chancellor's agents for questioning. 2 appeared. 1 fled. The very fact of his flight was proof enough. The 2 who were questioned gave testimony, under pressure. One admitted that he had passed on information to the Chancellor about the council's vote. The second admitted that, on the Chancellor's orders, he had blocked 3 petitions from impoverished nobles. The small council was furious. The Chancellor was interfering in their work. It was an insult. The fourth reaction. Silence. The King had received a letter about the poisoning, and he remained silent. 1 day, 2, 3. Cassell waited. Adelina said that the King didn't know what to do, that the accusation of poisoning a nobleman was a criminal matter requiring a trial, that a trial of the Chancellor would be a crisis for the state. The King fears a crisis. He has avoided crises his entire life. Cassell said he understood. He said the King didn't need a reason for a trial, but a way out, a way to get rid of the Chancellor without a trial, without a scandal, quietly. Adelina asked what that way was. Cassell said, resignation, voluntary. If the Chancellor resigned on his own, there would be no trial. There would be no scandal. Everyone would save face. Day 130, 5 months after the wedding. Ardent Bank opened a second branch in the village of Krom. Baron Krom became the manager. His debt was restructured after the Chancellor's downfall. The Valios were forced to agree to the new terms because the investigation into the fictitious debts hung over them like a sword of Damocles. 3% per annum, 15 years. Krom cried as he signed. It was the second time in the last 2 months, but this time it was out of joy. The third branch opened in Martinburg 2 weeks later, a small town at the crossroads of trade routes, 4,000 residents, 3 markets, 1 town square, and not a single bank. Cassell appointed Rowena as manager. She knew the logistics, the routes, and the prices. She knew which goods came from where and how much delivery cost. That was more valuable than any banking experience. Rowena hired 2 local assistants. She trained them in a week. Ardent Bank in Martinburg issued its first loans
3 days after opening.
The second series of Ardent bonds, 10,000 crowns, 1,000 bonds at 10 crowns each, 5% yield, plus 20,000 from Adelina, plus 14,000 from the Ronswoods, plus 60,000 in repayments on fictitious debts. Castle stared at the numbers and couldn't believe it. 104,000 crowns in assets. Just 3 months ago, he had nothing. Marilyn said that this represented growth to infinity%, and that infinity was not a valid accounting category. Clarissa said that technically it was indefiniteness, not infinity. Marilyn looked at her over her glasses. Clarissa fell silent. Year 1, day 365. Castle sat at a table in the library of Ardent Castle, the same library where he'd spent his first night drafting 12 financial plans. Only now, instead of a candle, there was a Teehee glass oil lamp on the table. On the shelves stood not dusty tomes, but folders of documents, loan ledgers, insurance policies, bonds, contracts, balance sheets. Marilyn sat across from him, tallying the year-end figures. Ardent Bank, 7 branches, 412 active borrowers, repayment rate 82%, insurance pool 506 participants, 6 sickness payouts for the year, each fully covered, notary office, 3 branches, pharmacy, 4 locations, blacksmith shop, orders booked 6 months in advance. The Ronswood castles were sold in the capital. Annual income of the barony, 123,000 crowns. Net assets, 310,000. Debt to Mercer, 238,000. Principal plus interest, 30% of the kingdom's noble debts have been restructured through Ardent Bank. 30% in a single year. Marilyn said that by this measure, Ardent Bank is the kingdom's second largest financial institution, after Valio. Castle said it wouldn't last long. Marilyn raised an eyebrow. Castle smiled. The investigation into fictitious debts has concluded. The Valio Guild has been found guilty of systematic fraud. The court ordered the nationalization of the guild's assets. All debt obligations were transferred to the management of the Office of Justice. Celeste Valio was not arrested. She was not convicted. She disappeared. A week before the verdict was handed down, she vanished, like smoke, as if she'd known in advance, as if she'd been preparing. Marilyn became the administrator of Valio's nationalized assets. Cassell proposed her candidacy to the small council. The council accepted it. Unanimously. The woman who had worked as Valio's accountant for 5 years knew their system better than anyone else. She could take it apart piece by piece. And she did just that. In 3 months, Marilyn conducted a full audit of all of Valio's debts. She found another 32 fictitious ones. The total amount of the fraud? 400,000 kroner. 400,000 kroner stolen from noble families over 20 years. Marilyn's favor, 50. Threshold. The system displayed the text. Merger of honor. Marilyn Voss transfers her skill to Baron Ardent. Skill, absolute accounting memory, the ability to see the financial structure of any organization at a glance. Cassell closed his eyes. When he opened them, the world looked different. The numbers above people's heads became 3-dimensional. He saw more than just honor and debt. He saw connections. Who owed whom? Who depended on whom? A web of debts and obligations hung before him like a map, alive, pulsating. He saw the entire kingdom as a single balance sheet, and that balance was skewed, severely, dangerously. The system was teetering on the brink. Marilyn looked at him. She didn't know what had happened, but she could see that he had changed, that his gaze was different now, deeper, wider. She asked if everything was all right. Castle said that now it was. For the first time in a year, now it was. The morning of the anniversary, Castle went down to the great hall. Bridget was making breakfast, pancakes, honey, mint tea. 12 women were seated at the table. All 12. For the first time in a year, not a single one was late. Not a single one stayed in her room. Everyone was here. Clarissa was counting something in her notebook. Tehi was polishing a glass goblet. Yona was scratching behind the ear of the family dog, which had grown into a huge, shaggy dog over the past year.
Rowena was laying out a map of a new trade route. Mei Lin was sketching the facade of the Ardent Bank building in the capital. Hana was sorting through herbs. Lyra was humming quietly. Soyeon was writing something in perfect handwriting. Bridget was flipping pancakes. Marilyn was reading a report.
Adelina was sitting upright and sipping her tea in small sips. And Isla sat next to Cassel, just as she had done every morning for the past 3 months. She didn't speak at breakfast. She just sat there. Sometimes their shoulders brushed against each other, by accident, or maybe not. Cassel didn't ask. He didn't comment. He just accepted it. He stood up. Everyone looked at him. He said that exactly 1 year ago he had been kneeling in the throne room, listening as his sentence was read to him, that they had thrown a lead coin at him. He took it out of his pocket. That very one. The lead one. The fake one. He carried it with him every day. A reminder. He said he'd put it in his pocket and sworn to turn that disgrace into a foundation. He said he hadn't done it alone, that each of the 12 women at this table had built a piece of that foundation. Isla forged, Soyeon wrote, Marilyn calculated, Hannah healed, Lara sang, Clarissa thought, Adelina negotiated, Rowena drove, Yona rode, Mei Lin built, Tai He invented, Bridget fed. He said that Ardent Bank wasn't just him. Ardent Bank was them. 12 skills, 12 stories, 12 decisions to stay when the whole world was telling them to run. He said he doesn't give out loans. He gives Hana medicine for her sister. Ale, a second chance for her father's horn. Soyeon, the voice she lost. Lyra, the song that was stolen from her. Money is just a way to package care so it can be accepted without shame. It was quiet at the table. Hana stared into her mug. Lyra bit her lip. Clarissa stopped counting. Even the dog fell silent. Marilyn took off her glasses and didn't wipe them. She just held them in her hand. Ayla sat motionless beside him, but her hand on the table shifted half an inch toward his. Half an inch. Castle noticed. He didn't pull away. Then a knock. A loud one. The gate. Everyone turned around. Barg rushed into the hall. His face was pale. He said people were coming toward the castle. A lot of people. 20 on horseback, dressed in black, with swords, and a carriage, black, with silver trim. Castle stood up. Everyone stood up. 12 women. Castle went out into the courtyard. The others followed him, in a semicircle, just like a year ago in the throne room. Only now they weren't standing as hostages, as a team. The gate opened. 20 fighters in black armor entered the courtyard, silently, in formation, swords at their belts. Behind them, the carriage. The black carriage came to a stop. The door opened. She looked at Cassel. 20 seconds. 30. Cassel looked back at her. The system displayed her numbers. Honor. 3. 3 out of 100. The lowest rating Cassel had seen in a year. Debt. 0. No one owed her anything. She owed everyone. But her debt wasn't measured in kronas. It was measured in lives. Celeste spoke. Her voice was low, steady. She said, "Hello, Master H." She said she'd been waiting for him for 200 years. The hall fell silent. The courtyard fell silent. Marilyn froze, her glasses in her hand. Cassel didn't freeze. He took a sip of tea. Then he replied. He said he didn't know what she was talking about, that his name was Cassel Ardent, that he was a baron, a banker, the husband of 12 women, and that he had an outstanding balance with Mrs. Valio, 200 years' worth of overdue interest. Isla jumped to her feet, a knife in her hand. That very one, engraved with Ardent. Soyeon grabbed a sheet of paper and a quill, ready to write. Hannah clutched a bottle of tincture strong enough to put a horse to sleep. Marilyn picked up the ledger. Clarissa stood next to Soyeon. Tai He held a glass goblet. Mei Lin stood with a drafting ruler. Rowena held a map rolled into a tube.
Yona whistled, and the dog bared its teeth. Bridget emerged from the kitchen with a frying pan in her hand. Adelina stood straight and cold, unarmed. Her weapons were words. Lyra was the last to stand. She didn't take anything. She opened her mouth and began to sing, softly. A single note, low, long. The note hung in the air and wouldn't fade. 12 different weapons, against 20 swords. Celeste watched them, the 12 women standing in a semicircle behind the gaunt baron with his cup of tea. Add a knife and a quill and a vial and a book and a glass and a ruler and a map and a frying pan and a dog and a voice. She watched, and for the first time in 20 years, an expression appeared on her face that Castle hadn't expected. Not anger, not contempt, not fear, curiosity. The pure, unclouded curiosity of a predator who had encountered prey unlike any it had ever seen before. Castle set the cup down on the table, slowly, carefully,
just as a surgeon would set down an instrument. He looked Celeste in the eyes. 3 out of 100. 3, to be exact. That meant the person standing before him was someone who had betrayed practically everyone she'd ever met. Every promise, every agreement, every handshake. 3 out of 100 meant this woman was untrustworthy. 3 out of 100 meant any contract with her was a worthless piece of paper. But 3 out of 100 meant something else as well. That long ago, Celeste Valio's honor had been higher. Much higher. Honor doesn't drop to 3 from birth. It drops because of decisions. Dozens of decisions, hundreds, over 20 years. Someone once trusted Celeste Valio. Someone believed her. And she betrayed every single one of them, one by one, until only 3 remained. Castle said that Ms. Valio could sit down, that breakfast hadn't gone cold yet, that they had things to talk about the book she stole 200 years ago, about the system she built on other people's ideas, turning them inside out, about a debt measured not in crowns, but in lives. About 3 out of 100. Celeste didn't sit down. She stood and watched. Then she said that Master X had written a book about how to make debt an instrument of trust, and she had made debt an instrument of power. She asked which was more effective. Castle answered. He said that power through debt lasts 20 years. Trust through debt lasts 200. He said he had proof. Her empire collapsed in a year. His bank got back on its feet in 3 months. Her honor rating was 3. His was 35 and rising. The math was simple. Celeste was silent. For a long time. The fighters behind her didn't move. The 12 women in front of her didn't move. The silence rang out like a note from Lyra. Then Celeste said she hadn't come to fight. She had come to watch. To see the men who in a single year had accomplished what had taken her 20 years, only in the other direction. She said there would be a war, but not today. Today she wanted to understand. She turned and walked toward the carriage. She stopped at the door. She turned back. She said that the book, Trust as Currency, was in her personal vault. The original. 200 years. She said that if Castle wanted to take it, he'd have to pay. Not with money, with something else. She didn't say what.
She got into the carriage. The door closed. 20 soldiers mounted their horses. The column turned around and rode off. Castle stood in the courtyard and watched the dust settle on the road. 12 women stood behind him. No one spoke. Then Ayla lowered her knife. Soyen put down her quill. Hannah hid the vial. Bridget returned to the kitchen. Marilyn put on her glasses. Lyra stopped singing. The dog lay down on the ground and sighed. Castle picked up the cup from the table. The tea had gone cold. He finished it in one gulp. Then he turned to the 12. He said that the second arc had begun. That Celeste Valio had left but would return. That the book trust as currency existed and was waiting for him. That he didn't know why he'd been dragged into this world, but he knew why he'd stayed. To prove that debt isn't a chain, that a promissory note isn't a death sentence, that 200,000 crowns isn't death but a beginning. He took a lead coin, the very same one. He placed it on the table next to an empty cup. The coin lay on the oak table. A fake, made of lead, worthless.
Next to it lay a folder containing a bank statement showing an annual income of 123,000 crowns. A year ago, he had only the coin. Now, he had the folder and 12 people who had helped fill it out. He said it was time to get to work. Marilyn nodded and opened a book. Soyan picked up a quill. Clarissa took out a notebook. Hannah went to the pharmacy. Rowena unfolded a map. Isla went into the smithy. A minute later, the sound of a hammer came from inside. Steady, rhythmic, like a heartbeat. Castle sat down at the table in the library. He placed his hands on the tabletop. He closed his eyes. The system hummed quietly in his head. 13,000 capital points, 35 honor units, 12 favor scales ranging from 20 to 50, 4 unlocked tools, restructuring, insurance, public bond, deposit, 4 more to go, stock, futures, cross audit, and the last one, the one the system displayed in gray. Locked, untitled, only the unlocking condition. Honor, 100 out of 100, all 12 brides. Favor, 100 out of 100. Complete trust, complete honesty, complete transparency. Not a single lie, not a single instance of coercion, not a single instance of manipulation. Only voluntary gratitude. Castle opened his eyes. A hammer was pounding outside the window. A quill rustled in the hallway. Dishes clattered in the kitchen. The scent of mint filled the apothecary. A horse snorted in the stable. The castle was alive. The bank was open. People trusted it. And somewhere far away, on the road to the capital, a woman in a silver veil was traveling. A woman who had been waiting 200 years for his return.